Alexandria, the 10th of August, 30 BC. The sun has not risen yet. The city sleeps badly because for 9 days now it has belonged to a stranger. Octavian's legions stand at the gates of the palace quarter. Roman warships ride at anchor in the harbour, where royal galleys with purple sails once lay. In the air there is salt and burnt wood, and something else that always comes to cities just before they stop being themselves. It is the smell of an ending. In the mausoleum she built for herself a few years ago, on the upper floor, in an inner room, a woman is sitting. She is 39 years old. She is dressed not as a prisoner, but as a queen. On her head a diadem. On her wrists gold bracelets shaped like the uraeus, the sacred serpent of the pharaohs. At her throat a necklace of lapis lazuli and carnelian. She has waited for the morning to come. She has waited for the servants to bring in a basket of figs. She has waited to be left in the room with 2 loyal women, Charmian and Iris. The doors are shut. Outside stands Octavian's guard, which let the basket through, because who would look for death among figs? She is looking out of the window. From there she can see the harbour. She can see the Pharos lighthouse, its crown already catching the first of the sun. She is not thinking about Antony, whom she bedded herself 9 days ago with royal honours. She is not thinking about Caesarion, her 17-year-old son, betrayed by his own tutors and turned back from the road to the Red Sea. She is not thinking about the 3 younger children who will be taken to Rome and paraded in a triumph. She is thinking about something else. She is thinking that she is not the first. And if the camera could pull back now, out of this room, above the mausoleum, above Alexandria, above the 6 generations that led to this morning, we would see 6 figures standing behind her. 6 women, all of them with the same name, all of them wearing the same diadem, all of them seated on the same throne. And almost none of them lived to grow old in her own bed. The first died young, and we still do not know why. The second was handed her dismembered son as a gift, and survived it. The third was killed by her own son. The fourth was cut down beside the statue of the god Apollo. The fifth was executed by a foreign king. The 6th was erased from the record so thoroughly that we are still not certain she existed at all. And the woman sitting in that mausoleum knows every one of them. She knows their names. She knows how they died. She knows that she is the 7th. Think about that for a moment. What it means to be born the 7th with that name, in a dynasty where the first 6 ended in blood, in poison, and in exile. What it means to grow up in a palace whose corridors still remember your great-grandmother screaming while your own ancestors killed her. What it means to be a child who reads the history of her own family and understands that history is not a book you study, it is a program you are expected to carry out. Every strategy has already been tried. Every marriage to a brother, every poisoning, every war against a sister, every alliance with a foreign army. All of it has happened before. All of it has already failed. And they call you by the same name. Tonight, when you close your eyes, I am not going to tell you the story of Cleopatra. Everybody knows the story of Cleopatra. Plutarch told it, and Shakespeare, and Hollywood, and the school textbooks, and every version is the seventh Cleopatra, the last Cleopatra, the one who met Caesar rolled up in a carpet and died of a serpent's bite. Everybody knows the seventh. But before her there were six. And tonight, slowly, without hurrying, we are going to walk through 275 years and 6 women who carried that name. We are going to see what the dynasty was made of, the dynasty that produced the most famous woman of the ancient world. We are going to see which of their mistakes she learned to avoid and which of them she repeated. We are going to see why she had to become what she became. And perhaps, at dawn, when you wake, you will understand something the textbooks do not. The seventh Cleopatra was not an exception. She was a conclusion. So, make yourself comfortable. Close your eyes. We are not beginning in the year 30 before Christ. We are beginning 165 years before that morning in a small border town called Raphia, where a girl named Cleopatra, the first Cleopatra, is standing in a wedding dress and does not yet understand that she is being handed over as a living peace treaty to a foreign throne in a foreign capital, where she will become the first of the 6 shadows behind the woman now sitting in the mausoleum at Alexandria. To understand who Cleopatra I was, you first have to understand the world she walked into, and that world was young. It was not yet 100 years old. When Alexander of Macedon died in Babylon in June of 323 before Christ, he left no heir. He was 32 years old. His wife Roxana was pregnant, but the child had not yet been born. The empire he had built in 12 years of conquest stretched from Greece to India and rested on no authority except his own. As he lay in the palace at Babylon in a fever, his generals asked him who he was leaving the kingdom to. They say he answered, "To the strongest." That one word set off 40 years of war. One of those generals was a man named Ptolemy. The son of a Macedonian nobleman, a childhood friend of Alexander, the commander of one of his cavalry units. A man of middling height, no beauty, but clever and careful. When Alexander's empire began to break apart, the other generals, Antigonus, Seleucus, Lysimachus, Cassander, went for the richest provinces. Ptolemy did something else. He took Egypt. Egypt was far away. Egypt was cut off on 3 sides by desert and sea. Egypt had the most fertile soil in the Mediterranean because every year the Nile rose and left silt behind it. Egypt had its own 3,000-year-old civilization, its own priests, its own religion, its own writing. And when Ptolemy arrived there in 323, he came not as a foreign conqueror, but as a satrap, who would very soon bring the body of Alexander with him. He stole it on the road 2 years later. As the funeral procession moved from Babylon towards Macedon, Ptolemy intercepted it and turned it south into Egypt. He knew that Alexander's body was worth more than gold. Alexander's body was legitimacy. At first it lay at Memphis, and later it was carried to Alexandria, into a tomb where it rested in a coffin of gold. Every future ruler of the Greek world came to pray at that coffin. Julius Caesar came to it 270 years later. Octavian came to it 290 years later. All of them wanted to touch that body, because to touch it was to touch the kind of power Alexander had held, and they wanted to hold. Ptolemy declared himself king in 305 before Christ. He took the throne name Soter, which in Greek means saviour. He founded what historians would call the Ptolemaic dynasty. 275 years, 15 male Ptolemies, 7 Cleopatras, several women named Berenice, Arsinoe, Selene, one of the longest and bloodiest family lines of the ancient world. The first Ptolemy died very old, peacefully in his own bed. It was the last death of that kind in the dynasty for a very long time. His son Ptolemy II Philadelphus had already done the thing that would become the mark of the family. He married his own sister. Her name was Arsinoe. This was not an Egyptian tradition, as people sometimes think. Egyptian pharaohs did occasionally marry their sisters, but it was never the rule. This was a different tradition, a tradition of keeping the blood undivided, which the Ptolemies borrowed partly from Egyptian practice and partly from their own arithmetic. If your sister becomes your wife, her children are your heirs, and she has nowhere to look for another ally. If you marry your sister to a foreign king, you acquire a brother-in-law with a claim to your throne. The incest was not passion, it was cold calculation. There was no eros in it, there was geometry of power. And inside that geometry, 100 years after the dynasty was founded, at the end of the 3rd century before Christ, a girl is born who will become the first Cleopatra on the Alexandrian throne. But she is not born in Alexandria. She is born in Antioch. Her father is Antiochus III, called the Great, king of the Seleucid Empire. That is the other piece of what was left of Alexander. The Seleucids had taken Syria, Mesopotamia, Persia, an enormous eastern space in which Antiochus was trying to rebuild what Alexander once held. He fought the Parthians, the Armenians, the Greek cities of Asia Minor. He was ambitious, intelligent, tireless, and lethally dangerous to every one of his neighbours. One of those neighbours was Ptolemaic Egypt. 2 Greek states, 2 inheritances from Alexander, 2 courts that spoke Greek and worshipped Greek gods, fought each other endlessly over southern Syria, over the strip of land that runs from Gaza to Damascus. They called that land Coele Syria, the Hollow Syria. It held important cities, Tyre, Sidon, Damascus. The trade roads ran through it. Whoever held it controlled the traffic between east and west. In the year 200 before Christ, Antiochus III marched against Ptolemy V Epiphanes. Ptolemy V was a child. He had been 5 years old when he took the throne, and Egypt was in fact governed by regents. Antiochus decided this was a perfect moment. He destroyed the Egyptian army at the Battle of Panium, a place you may know by its later name, Caesarea Philippi, near the springs of the Jordan. Antiochus took Coele Syria. Ptolemaic Egypt lost its most valuable possessions abroad. And here Antiochus did something unexpected. Instead of marching on Alexandria, he stopped. He was a shrewd politician. He knew that a shadow was already growing behind him, and the shadow was Rome. The Romans had just beaten Carthage in the Second Punic War and were beginning to look east. Antiochus understood that destroying Ptolemaic Egypt was against his own interest, because then he would be left alone facing the Romans. He needed Egypt as an ally, or at the very least as a neutral, so he offered peace. The terms were simple. He would return Coele Syria to shared possession, formally. In practice, Coele Syria stayed his, and he would give his daughter in marriage to the young Ptolemy V. That daughter was called Cleopatra. She was the first of the 6 shadows that would one day stand behind the 7th. She was about 9 years old when her father signed that treaty. The wedding would take place later, when she and Ptolemy were a little older. But from the age of 9, her life was already decided. She was to travel from Antioch to Egypt. She was to leave her father, her mother, her brothers, her sisters, the courtiers, the language of her childhood, and walk into a foreign court as the wife of a foreign king. Picture it. Picture an 11-year-old girl being carried from Syria into Egypt with a retinue around her, first overland, then by ship. The journey took weeks. She had never seen Alexandria. She had never seen the boy she was to marry. All she knew about him was that he was about 17, that he was an orphan, that he wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and that his courtiers were governing in his place. The ships sailed down the Levantine coast. She watched the shoreline. She saw Tyre with its purple dye works, Sidon with its glass workshops, Acre, Gaza. These were cities that had just passed from her father to her future husband, and then, after her marriage, were supposed to belong legally to Egypt, but in practice to her father. Her marriage was a living contract of joint ownership. She was not a bride, she was a signature. In the year 193 before Christ, she was brought to Raphia, a town on the border, and the wedding took place there. Then she came ashore at Alexandria. The city where she would spend the rest of her life was then the largest in the Greek world. 300,000 people. The Pharos Lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders. The great library, whose holdings ancient writers counted in hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The Museon, the first research institution in the world. The palace of the Ptolemies took up a quarter of the city. She was met by a young man not yet 20, Ptolemy V Epiphanes. He had a narrow face, dark hair, thin hands. He wore a golden diadem and a purple tunic. He spoke Greek with an Alexandrian accent. She spoke Greek with an Antiochian accent. They could understand each other, but each of them heard something foreign in the other's mouth. The Alexandrians looked at their new queen with suspicion. She was the daughter of their greatest enemy. She was the girl whose father had just taken Coele Syria away from them. In the streets they whispered that she was a Trojan horse, that her father was sending her to destroy Egypt from the inside. At court they whispered that she would have to be poisoned before she produced an heir. Among the priests they whispered that a foreigner could not be the mother of a pharaoh. But she stayed alive, and she began the thing that would become her strategy for the rest of her life. She went over to her husband's side. That sounds simple, but it was extraordinary. Everyone expected her to be her father's agent. Everyone expected her to send information back to Antioch, to press Seleucid interests in Alexandria, to be a Syrian princess sitting on an Egyptian throne. Instead, she became an Egyptian queen. She learned Alexandrian custom. She began appearing beside her husband at official ceremonies. She received ambassadors. She let it be understood that her home was here now. A few years later, she bore a son. They named him Ptolemy, as always, with the number 6 after it. Then another son, also with a number, the one who would become Ptolemy VIII. Then a daughter, who was named Cleopatra, Cleopatra II, the second of the 6 shadows, the first of them to be born in Alexandria. The marriage of Cleopatra I and Ptolemy V lasted 13 years. They were quiet years for Egypt. There were no great wars. The economy recovered a little. Alexandria went on growing. And then, in the year 180 before Christ, Ptolemy V died without warning. He was about 30 years old. He was healthy. He was planning a campaign against the Seleucids. Cleopatra's father was dead by then, her brother was ruling in Syria, and Ptolemy V had decided this was the moment to take back Coele Syria. He was raising an army. He was raising the taxes to pay for it. And then, one morning, he did not wake up. His contemporaries wrote that he was poisoned. By whom? Nobody knows. Some sources point at his own ministers, who feared the war and feared that new taxes would set off a rebellion. Some point at the army commanders themselves, who did not want to fight the Seleucids. Some hinted at Cleopatra I, because the war was aimed at her own family and she had a motive. None of the versions is proven. There is only the fact. The death was sudden. The king was about 30, and he had been healthy until that morning. Now Cleopatra I became regent. Her son, Ptolemy VI, was about 6 years old. Her daughter, Cleopatra II, was about 5. The younger son was still very small. She had suddenly been handed something she had not expected. She had become the real ruler of the largest Greek state in the world. And what she did over the next 4 years proves that she was a brilliant politician. She stopped every preparation for war with the Seleucids. She made peace with her own brother, who was now ruling in Antioch. She stabilized the economy. She left Coele Syria in Seleucid hands, which was formally a betrayal of Egyptian interests, and, in practice, saved Egypt from a war it was not ready to fight. She began striking coins with her own portrait, and for the first time in the dynasty, a queen stood on them not as the king's wife, but as the one ruling in his place. She governed in his name. Documents from those years often open with the words, Queen Cleopatra and King Ptolemy command. Her name stands first. That was the thing that was genuinely without precedent. In Ptolemaic practice, the king always came first, even when the king was a small boy, and even when the queen was doing the ruling. 4 years of regency. 4 years in which this woman, who had arrived in Alexandria as an 11-year-old foreigner, held one of the richest states in the Mediterranean in her hands. She survived in a palace where her father was still remembered as the enemy. She taught her son. She gave him the understanding that Egypt mattered more than loyalty to Seleucid blood. And then, in the year 176 before Christ, she died. She was about 28 years old. That is very young. The sources give no cause of death. Some historians suspect illness, perhaps malaria, which came through Alexandria regularly. Some suspect childbed fever, though there is no direct evidence of a birth that year. Some suspect poison, because her death conveniently freed the throne for courtiers who wanted different policies from hers. As with her husband's death, there is no direct proof. There is only the fact. A young woman, energetic, at the height of her powers, in command, dies suddenly. And after her death, everything changes. Her son, Ptolemy VI, was about 10. Her daughter, Cleopatra II, was about 9. The younger son, Ptolemy VIII, was still a child, about 8. Suddenly, 3 children were left without a mother and effectively without protection. And that is when the thing happened that determined everything after it. The Alexandrian court decided that now, without Cleopatra I, the dynasty had to be reinforced. The method was tested. Ptolemy II had married his sister. Ptolemy IV had married his sister. Now it was the turn of Ptolemy VI. He was 10. His sister Cleopatra II was 9. They were married. Picture it. 2 children, a brother and a sister, who have just buried their mother. They are stood up in the throne room, wedding crowns are put on their heads, priests recite the prayers. They do not entirely understand what is happening. They were sharing toys a year ago. Now they are king and queen, husband and wife, sister and brother. That was the moment the dynasty condemned itself. Cleopatra I died without seeing what she had set in motion. Perhaps she would have approved. She had entered the dynasty through a dynastic marriage herself. She understood the geometry of power. Perhaps she would have stopped it, and a mother's instinct would have beaten the political logic. We do not know. She died too early to have an opinion about what became of her children. But here is what we do know. Her daughter, 9-year-old Cleopatra II, was married to her own brother. That fixed in place a chain of brother and sister marriages that ran through the Ptolemaic dynasty for the next 150 years. Every one of the 6 Cleopatras who followed would be married either to her own brother, or to her own uncle, or to both in turn. Not one of them would marry a stranger by her own choice. Not one of them would have anything we would call a married life. And in the same palace where Cleopatra I had just been buried, in the same corridors that still smelled of her, another story begins. The story of her daughter. The one who would become the second shadow. The one who would get the longest and bloodiest reign of all 6. The one whose second brother-husband would send her, on her birthday, the dismembered body of her son. Her name was Cleopatra, the second of that name in the dynasty, the first to be born in Alexandria itself. Her childhood lasted exactly 9 years. Then they put her in a wedding dress and walked her to her brother. Marrying children does not immediately make them husband and wife. For the first years after the wedding, Cleopatra II and Ptolemy VI lived as brother and sister, because that is what they were. They had been married to lock the line of succession into place, not so that they would begin a marriage. King and Queen were their official titles. In practice, the regents governed for them. 2 senior courtiers, a eunuch named Julius and a man named Linnaeus, took power into their own hands after the death of Cleopatra I. They governed Egypt in the children's name, and, as it turned out later, they walked the country into a catastrophe. Julius and Linnaeus decided to do the thing Cleopatra I had never risked. They decided to take back Coele Syria. They prepared for war with the Seleucids. They gathered troops, stockpiled gold, ordered ships. In the year 170 before Christ, they declared war on Antiochus IV, called Epiphanes, who was then ruling in Antioch. Antiochus IV was Cleopatra II's uncle on her mother's side. Her dead mother, Cleopatra I, had been his sister. That fact should have been an obstacle, but in the Greek world, dynastic ties did not stop wars, they decorated them. Antiochus announced that he was coming to free his nephews from wicked regents. The regents announced that they were coming to recover the lawful territory of Egypt. Each side dressed its cause as justice. Antiochus turned out to be the better general. He destroyed the Egyptian army in the Sinai desert. He pushed further. He took Pelusium, the key fortress on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta. Then he moved on Memphis, the ancient capital, where the pharaohs were crowned. Ptolemy VI, who was about 16 then, ended up in Antiochus's hands. Antiochus treated his nephew with perfect courtesy. He dined with him, embraced him in front of witnesses, called him the lawful ruler of Egypt. And meanwhile, his army was closing on Alexandria. Alexandria panicked. The younger line of the dynasty, the younger brother of Ptolemy VI, the same Ptolemy VIII, who was about 15 at the time, suddenly became the city's only hope. The Alexandrians proclaimed him sole king. They said, "The elder brother is a prisoner of the Syrians. He cannot rule, so the younger will rule." That produced a very strange situation. Egypt suddenly had two kings. Ptolemy VI, under Antiochus's protection in Memphis, and Ptolemy VIII in Alexandria, and one queen between them, Cleopatra II. Antiochus marched on Alexandria. He came up to the city and began a siege. If that siege had succeeded, he would have taken the whole valley of the Nile and joined Egypt to his own kingdom. It would have been the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty. It would have happened in the year 168 before Christ, and Cleopatra VII would never have existed, because none of her ancestors would have been left in the world. And then something happened that changed the history of the Mediterranean. In July of that same year, a single ship came into the harbour of Alexandria. On board was a Roman senator. His name was Gaius Popilius Laenas. He was not a young man, grey-bearded, in a senator's toga. In Rome, he had a reputation for bluntness, for saying things straight without the usual diplomacy. The Senate had sent him with a simple mission: stop the war. Rome had just finished its business in Macedon. At the Battle of Pydna in June of that year, the Roman consul Lucius Aemilius Paulus had destroyed the Macedonian king Perseus. Macedon ceased to exist as an independent state. For the first time, Rome held the whole situation in the eastern Mediterranean in its hands. And Rome did not want Antiochus IV adding Egypt to himself, because that would create an enormous new power on the southern shore of the sea, a power that suited Rome very badly. The senator Popilius Laenas came off his ship. He walked through Antiochus's camp. He was alone, with no army, no bodyguard, one old man in a toga. He walked up to the tent of the Syrian king, who had 40,000 soldiers around him. Antiochus came out to meet him. They knew each other. Antiochus had once lived in Rome as a hostage, and the two of them had been on friendly terms in their youth. Antiochus put out his hand in greeting. Popilius did not take it. He silently drew a scroll out of the folds of his toga. It was a decree of the Roman Senate. It said that Antiochus was to end his war with Egypt at once, withdraw his troops, and go home. Antiochus read it. He said, "Very well, I shall consult my friends and give you an answer." Then Popilius did the thing that went into history as one of the boldest diplomatic gestures of the ancient world. He took the vine staff he was carrying. In silence, he drew a circle in the sand around Antiochus. And he said, "Before you step out of that circle, give me an answer I can carry to the Senate." Antiochus stood in the circle. Around him, 40,000 of his own soldiers. In front of him, one old Roman with a stick. He was silent for a long time, and then he said, "I will do what the Senate demands." He stepped out of the circle. He gave the order for his army to withdraw. By the evening of that same day, the Syrians were striking their tents. Within a week, they were out of Egypt. That moment is called the Day of Eleusis, because it all took place in a suburb of Alexandria by that name. And it was the day the valley of the Nile was saved, not by its own sword, but by a Roman sentence. From that day on, Egypt effectively stopped being an independent state. It became dependent on Rome. Not formally. Formally, it remained the kingdom of the Ptolemies for almost another 140 years. But everyone knew that without Rome, there was no Egypt. Every decision the Ptolemies took from that moment on was taken with one eye on what the senators in Rome would say. Ptolemy VI came back to Alexandria, and here another strange situation began. He came back, but his younger brother was already sitting on the throne. The Alexandrians agreed that the three of them would rule together. The elder brother, Ptolemy VI, his sister and wife, Cleopatra II, and the younger brother, Ptolemy VIII, three co-rulers. Their heads were struck together on the coins. Their names stood together on the documents. That was without precedent even for the Ptolemies, who were used to unusual arrangements. At first, the arrangement worked. The younger brother, Ptolemy VIII, was nothing like the elder. The elder was slim, quiet, well-read, mild-tempered. The younger was fat, with bulging eyes and a heavy jaw, and an appetite for food and pleasure. The Alexandrians nicknamed him Physcon, which in Greek means pot-belly. That name stayed with him for the rest of his life. He was 2 years younger than his brother and twice as wide across the shoulders. He was cruel and he was clever. Even then, at 15, he looked at the throne as something he was going to have alone. Cleopatra II lived between the two brothers. One was her husband, the other her brother-in-law. She bore Ptolemy VI 4 children. First, a son, who was named Ptolemy Eupator, then 2 daughters, Cleopatra Thea, which means goddess, and Cleopatra III. Then another son, also named Ptolemy. The eldest boy, Eupator, was the hope of the dynasty. He was to inherit the throne when he grew up. About 6 years went by like that, 6 years in which 3 Ptolemies ruled together. And then, in the year 164 before Christ, the younger brother, Ptolemy VIII, made his first move. He rose against the elder. He raised the Alexandrian crowd, drove Ptolemy VI out of the city, and declared himself sole king. the elder brother fled. He went to Rome to ask for help. In Rome, he appeared before the Senate not as a king, but as a petitioner. He came in plain clothes, without a retinue, without gifts, because he no longer had any. He asked the Senate to restore him to his throne. The Senate was sympathetic. Rome did not want Ptolemy VIII growing stronger. He was younger, more aggressive, more ambitious. The Senate sent envoys who put pressure on Alexandria. Ptolemy VIII gave way reluctantly. It was settled that the brothers would rule separately. The elder would have Egypt and Cyprus. The younger would have Cyrenaica, which is to say Libya, each with his own capital, each with his own court. Cleopatra II stayed with her elder brother and husband in Alexandria. Her son Ptolemy Eupator was growing up. In the year 152, when he was about 12, they began preparing him for joint rule. That was the tradition. The eldest son was made junior king so that he could learn government beside his father. But that same year the boy suddenly died. He was 12 years old, healthy, educated, ready for power, and then suddenly dead. The sources give no cause. Some historians suspect illness, some suspect poison. If it was poison, the most likely man behind it was the boy's uncle, Ptolemy VIII, sitting in Cyrenaica and dreaming of a return to Alexandria. There is no direct evidence, but the death of Ptolemy Eupator was convenient for his uncle and inconvenient for everybody else. Cleopatra II mourned her son. There was another boy, born some years earlier, around 157. He had been given the same name, Ptolemy, with the number 7 after it. This one survived. He became the new heir, and 7 years later, in the year 145 before Christ, a battle was fought in Syria in which her husband was killed. Ptolemy VI had gone north against a usurper in Antioch, a complicated piece of Seleucid intrigue that he had involved himself in because his son-in-law was there, the husband of his daughter Cleopatra III. In the battle, Ptolemy's horse was brought down. The king fell. His skull was broken open. He lived a few days more and then died. His body was brought back to Alexandria. He was about 41 years old. Cleopatra II was left a widow with a young son, Ptolemy VII. She was about 40. She tried to establish rule of her own in her son's name, the way her mother had once ruled in her brother's name. She began striking coins with her portrait. She appealed to the people of Alexandria. She reminded them that she was the daughter of Cleopatra I, the granddaughter of Antiochus the Great, the wife of a lawful king and the mother of a lawful heir. Her blood was the best in the dynasty. But there was another claimant waiting in Cyrenaica. Her younger brother Ptolemy VIII, Physcon. He had not forgotten being pushed out of Alexandria 18 years earlier. He had not forgotten that the throne, in his own mind, was him. The moment the news of Ptolemy VI's death arrived, Physcon boarded a ship and set out for Alexandria. He did not bring an army, he brought an offer. He wrote to his sister, "I will come back. We will rule together. You will marry me. We will make peace." The alternative was a civil war in which small Ptolemy VII would not survive. Cleopatra II agreed. She had no choice, or at least That is how it looked to her. Alexandria was split into factions. The army had been weakened by the Syrian campaign in which her husband died. Her son was small, about 12. If a war started, he would be the first one killed. She agreed to marry her younger brother. This is where the darkest part of the story begins. Ptolemy VIII arrived in Alexandria in the autumn of 145 before Christ. He was about 40 years old. He was fat. His face sagged. His eyes were always wet. His movements were slow. The Alexandrians who remembered him as a young man barely recognized him. He came through the city to the palace. Cleopatra II was waiting for him. Beside her stood her son, 12-year-old Ptolemy VII, the lawful heir to the throne. The wedding was set for the next few days. Everything had to be quick. The peace had to be formally sealed before anyone in the city could organize resistance. On the wedding day, there was a banquet. Courtiers, priests, and the representatives of the Alexandrian factions gathered in the great hall of the palace. Offerings to the gods, music, toasts. Young Ptolemy VII sat beside his mother. He was in ceremonial dress, as a junior king handing the throne to a stepfather. He was smiling. He was a child. At a certain point, when everyone was already drinking, a gift was brought to the bride. That was the custom. The groom presented the bride with something in the middle of the feast. Servants carried in a vessel covered with a cloth. They set it down in front of Cleopatra II. Ptolemy VIII gestured, "Open it." She lifted the cloth. Inside the vessel was her son's head. Beside it, his hands. Beside them, his feet. The body had been taken apart before it was carried in. The boy had been killed that same day, before the feast, in the next wing of the palace. Ptolemy VIII did it with his own hands, some of the sources say. Others say his guards did it on his order. The murder at that wedding feast comes to us from Justin, who writes that the boy died in his mother's arms, and the vessel belongs to a second killing that the ancient writers seem to have folded into this one. Cleopatra II looked at her son in the vessel. She had two options in front of her: cry out and be killed on the spot along with every relative and supporter she had, say nothing, and go on living with that picture in her head until the end of her life. She said nothing. She put the cloth back over the vessel. She lifted her cup of wine. She drank to the health of her new husband. The banquet continued. This happened in September of the year 145 before Christ. Her son was about 12. Her new husband was about 40. Her first husband, their dead brother, would have been 41 that year. She lived with the man who killed her son for the next 13 years. That marriage was without precedent even for the Ptolemies. Normally, the dynastic incest stayed inside one generation. A brother took a sister. Here, something else happened. A man took the widow of his murdered brother, who was at the same time his own full sister. And then, a few years later, he took that widow's daughter as well, their shared niece. This happened in the year 142 before Christ. Ptolemy VIII, without dissolving his marriage to Cleopatra II, married her daughter by her first marriage, Cleopatra III, who was then about 18 years old. Now there were 3 of them living in the palace. The uncle husband, the aunt wife, who was simultaneously her husband's sister and the mother of his other wife, the niece wife, who was the daughter of the first wife. All three of them wore the crown. All three of them were official co-rulers. Documents from this period open with the words King Ptolemy, Queen Cleopatra the sister, and Queen Cleopatra the wife. The sister is Cleopatra II. The wife is Cleopatra III, the younger one. This humiliated Cleopatra II more deeply than anything before it. Her brother husband had put her own daughter on the throne beside her. Her daughter, whom she had born and raised, was now sitting next to her and sharing her husband. It was worse than the murder of her son. It was slow, daily humiliation. Cleopatra II waited 10 years. 10 years she lived in that palace beside the daughter she had once taught to walk. 10 years she smiled at official ceremonies. 10 years she watched her daughter bear children to her own brother husband, 2 sons and 3 daughters. Her grandchildren were also her stepchildren. Her daughter was also her rival. And then, in the year 132 before Christ, she made her move. She raised a rebellion in Alexandria. It happened almost spontaneously. The Alexandrians hated Ptolemy VIII. He was a brutal ruler. He drove Greek intellectuals out of the city in mass expulsions. He broke up the protection of the Museion. He executed people over trifles. He taxed the city beyond what it could bear. The Alexandrians were waiting for a spark. Cleopatra II gave them the spark. She came out onto the palace steps and said, "My husband has killed my son, my honor and my name, and now he wants to kill my city." The Alexandrians took it up. They set fire to the palace quarter. Ptolemy VIII fled. He took Cleopatra III and their children with him. They sailed for Cyprus. Cleopatra II was left in Alexandria alone. For the first time in her whole life, alone. Without a husband, without a brother, without an uncle, without a son. She was about 53. She declared herself sole queen. She began striking coins with her portrait and nobody else's. She brought the exiled philosophers back into the city. She tried to rule by herself. It lasted about 3 years. Ptolemy VIII spent that time gathering strength on Cyprus. He was a master of the long game. He knew that Alexandria could not hold out alone, that it needed the provinces behind it, and most of the provinces stayed loyal to him, because his garrisons were in them. He cut Alexandria off from the rest of Egypt piece by piece. The city began to starve. And then he made the other gesture he is remembered for. It happened in the year 131 before Christ, on Cleopatra II's birthday. She was turning about 54. For her birthday, she was sent a present, the way she had been at her wedding. It was a chest. Inside the chest was the body of her son. This time it was their own child, the son of Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra II herself, a boy called Ptolemy Memphites, about 14 years old. He had been born at Memphis during a royal progress up the Nile, and the city gave him his name. He was her last child, and the last thing left in the world that was hers. Ptolemy VIII had his own son killed, had the body cut apart, and sent it to his sister and wife as a birthday gift. He did it from exile, and the chest crossed to Alexandria by sea. Why did he do it? He knew that Cleopatra II had survived the first gift. He wanted to prove that he could do it again. He wanted to prove that his cruelty had no limit, and that her capacity to endure did. It was an act of psychological war. This time she did not take it the way she had taken the first. She showed the boy's body to the Alexandrians. She laid the dismembered remains out in the square in front of the palace. She wanted the city to see what it was fighting. It was meant to be the gesture that raised resistance to a new level. The opposite happened. The Alexandrians were frightened. They saw what their former king was capable of. They began going over to his side, or leaving the city. By the end of the year 130, Alexandria was exhausted. Hunger, disease, reprisals against supporters of Ptolemy VIII, counterattacks. Cleopatra II understood that she could not win alone. She did something unexpected. She turned for help not to the Romans, but to the Seleucid king Demetrius II, who was the husband of her daughter Cleopatra III from her first marriage. That is, to her own son-in-law by the dead Ptolemy VI. Demetrius agreed to come. He set out south from Syria, but he never reached Egypt. He was intercepted by his own Seleucid enemies. A new war broke out in Syria, and Demetrius was killed. Cleopatra II was left without an ally. Then came the part nobody expected. In the year 127, Ptolemy VIII took Alexandria back, and it was Cleopatra II who had to run north into Syria to her daughter Cleopatra III. 3 years later, in 124, she came home. And instead of meeting the man with the sword, she agreed to a reconciliation. She went out to meet him. She kissed his hand. She agreed to be his wife again, beside her daughter Cleopatra III. Why did she agree? Because she had understood the thing every Ptolemy before her had understood. Conflict inside the dynasty is death for the dynasty. Either all three rule together, or all three fall together, and the throne is taken by the Romans or by somebody else. She chose the survival of the line. She chose the possibility that her hated daughter and her hated husband would produce grandchildren, and that the line would run on from them all the way to the 7th Cleopatra. She chose the family over her own dignity. So the three of them began living together again. The uncle husband, the sister wife, the daughter wife. Their three names appeared side by side on the documents again. Their three portraits were struck side by side on the coins again. It lasted another 8 years. In the year 116 before Christ, Ptolemy VIII died. He was about 68. He had lived a long and brutal life, and he died in his own bed, without poison, without betrayal, simply of illness or age. He outlived almost every one of his victims. In his will, he left the kingdom not to a son of his own choosing, but to Cleopatra III, together with whichever of their sons she preferred. The elder son by Cleopatra III was Ptolemy IX, nicknamed Lathyros, the chickpea. The younger was Ptolemy X, nicknamed Alexander. Cleopatra II and Cleopatra III remained co-rulers, but real power was passing to the next generation. Cleopatra II lived about another year. She died sometime around 115 before Christ. She was about 68 years old. That was the longest life anyone in the Ptolemaic family managed in that whole era. She outlived her first brother-husband. She outlived her second brother-husband. She outlived every one of her sons. She lived through a coup, an exile, a return, and a reconciliation with the man who murdered her children. She died a natural death in the palace where her mother had once arrived as an 11-year-old foreigner out of Antioch. If her mother was shadow number 1 behind the 7th Cleopatra, a thin, proud, early shadow, then Cleopatra II was shadow number 2, the longest and the bloodiest. She spent 7 decades inside a machine that devoured everyone. She was the first to show that you could survive that machine if you were prepared to endure absolutely anything. She was the first to be handed a dismembered son as a gift and not die of grief that same day. She was the first to go back to the butchers of her own family and embrace them, because the alternative was the end of the dynasty. And when, 85 years later, her great-great-granddaughter, Cleopatra VII, sat in a mausoleum working out her last move, she was thinking about Cleopatra II, because of all 6 shadows behind her, it was the second one who taught her the essential lesson. Survival matters more than dignity. The dynasty matters more than the child. Patience outlasts revenge. But the daughter of Cleopatra II, that same niece and wife of Ptolemy VIII, Cleopatra III, turned out differently. She did not learn patience. She learned hunting, and the next story is hers. She was born in a palace where her mother had already been the wife of her own brother for 10 years and Queen of Egypt. They named her Cleopatra, the third of that name. She was the granddaughter of the first Cleopatra, the daughter of the second, and the niece and stepdaughter of the man who would become her own husband. 4 generations of Ptolemaic blood ran in her, and 1 generation of Seleucid. There was more blood in her childhood than there was in her veins. We do not know the exact date of her birth. Historians put it somewhere around the year 160 before Christ, give or take a few years. Which means that when her mother Cleopatra II married her second brother Ptolemy VIII, the man who at the wedding feast would show her a vessel with her son's body in it, Cleopatra III was about 15. She was there. She saw that wedding. She saw her mother lift the cloth off the vessel. She saw the dismembered remains of her elder brother on the table beside the wine cups. She saw her mother say nothing and drink to the health of her new husband. What does a 15-year-old girl feel when she watches that? What stays in her mind after a scene like that? The ancient sources do not describe her reaction. They rarely describe how women reacted to cruelty, but we can guess. She understood 2 things that day. The first was that in this family you can trust nobody, not even your own blood. The second was that the one who is capable of that kind of cruelty is the one who ends up with the power. Her mother said nothing and survived. Her uncle killed and took the crown. That was the formula, and she remembered it for the rest of her life. 3 years after that wedding, in the year 142 before Christ, Ptolemy VIII married her, without dissolving his marriage to her mother. He was about 42, she was about 18. He was her uncle on her mother's side, and at the same time her stepfather through her mother's second marriage. Now he became her husband. One man playing 3 roles at once. Why did it happen? The ancient sources give several versions. Justin writes that Ptolemy VIII simply wanted the younger woman and took her because he could. Diodorus points to political calculation, that the elder Cleopatra was dangerous because she still remembered the murder of her son, and that a younger wife created a counterweight to her inside the palace. Cleopatra III herself, if we believe a few remarks in later sources, did not resist. It is possible she proposed the marriage herself. It is possible she had worked out that this was the only way she would ever be queen in her own right, instead of a shadow behind her mother. It is possible that her years of watching her mother had taught her that in this family either you take power or power takes you. So began an extraordinary household of 3. 1 man, 2 women, the sister wife and the daughter wife. All 3 of them wore crowns. All 3 of them signed decrees. All 3 of them appeared together at official ceremonies. Their 3 portraits were struck in a single row on the coins. Their 3 names stood side by side in the documents. The Alexandrians had seen a great many strange things come out of that palace, and even for them, this was too much. There were jokes in the city. The priests of Serapis went looking through the old texts for a way to read the omens. The philosophers of the Museion wrote treatises on the customs of barbarians, which was a way of discussing their own kings without naming them. Cleopatra III bore Ptolemy VIII 5 children over the next 12 years, 2 sons, 3 daughters. The sons were given the name Ptolemy, as always in the dynasty. The daughters were given the names Cleopatra, Tryphaena, and Selene. The elder son, who would eventually become Ptolemy IX, was nicknamed Lathyros, the chickpea, for some feature of his face that we cannot now identify. The younger, Ptolemy X, would later be nicknamed Alexander. The daughter, called Cleopatra, took the number 4 in the dynastic list, and she is the one who will die in the temple of Apollo. The daughter, called Selene, is Cleopatra V Selene, the one who will spend 30 years in Syria married to Seleucids. The daughter, called Tryphaena, would be married to a Seleucid king as well. Every one of these children was programmed from birth. They were born not for lives, but for marriages and wars. The boys were to inherit the throne of Egypt. The girls were to go to Syria and marry Seleucids to shore up the eastern alliances. Each of them had a dynastic function assigned in the cradle. And what of the elder Cleopatra, Cleopatra II, during all this? She lived in the same palace. She watched her daughter bear children to her own brother husband. She watched people address her daughter as Your Majesty, exactly as they addressed her. She watched her daughter lead the courtiers into dinner, grant audiences, receive ambassadors. Her daughter had taken over half of her life. Her daughter had become her rival. The hatred between mother and daughter accumulated and grew with every year. not loud, not open. That was not how things were done at the Ptolemaic court. It was quiet, slow, poisonous. It expressed itself in small things, in who enters the throne room first, in whose portrait comes first on the new coin, in who receives the letter from the Roman envoy. All of it mattered. Behind those small things stood one large struggle over who would be the principal queen of Egypt. In the year 132 before Christ, as we remember from the last chapter, Cleopatra II raised a rebellion against her husband. The Alexandrians supported her. Ptolemy VIII fled to Cyprus. Cleopatra III went with him, and their 5 children with her. The elder Cleopatra was left in Alexandria alone, as the victorious queen, for a short while, which meant that the younger Cleopatra, our Cleopatra III, had to go into exile alongside her husband. She was about 28 at the time. She had 5 children, the eldest of them about 10. She left the palace she had grown up in. She sailed for Cyprus, not knowing whether she would ever come back. On Cyprus, there began 3 years of difficult, bitter, grinding exile. Ptolemy VIII took his anger out on whatever was nearest. He drank. He had people executed at random. He made plans to return to Alexandria, and every plan failed. Cleopatra III saw her husband at close range, in defeat, without a court, without ceremony. She saw what she had never seen in Alexandria, that he was not only cruel, but also weak, that his cruelty came out of fear, that he could weep at night, that he could shower abuse on his own children. And there, on Cyprus, in the shadow of this unlovely man, Cleopatra III became what she was meant to become. She became a real politician. She began writing letters. She approached the Roman Senate calmly, in businesslike terms, not as an exile, but as the Queen of Egypt, temporarily outside her capital, owing to a disturbance in the city. She negotiated with the Cypriot garrisons. She raised money from Phoenician merchants. She kept up her contacts with the Egyptian priesthood, who had stayed in the country and were not backing Alexandria. She was building a network. In the year 131 before Christ, on the elder Cleopatra's birthday, the second chest was sent. The chest with the body of Ptolemy Memphites. I will not repeat that story. It was told in detail in the last chapter. I will say one thing. Cleopatra III was standing next to the man who decided it. The boy was her half-brother and at the same time her stepson. She had lived in the same palace as him, seen him every day, known him all his life, and she did not say a single word against it, because it was an instrument of political war against her mother. She agreed to hand over another woman's child in order to break that woman's spirit. That is what makes her a different kind of shadow from the 2 before her. Her mother accepted the death of her son as the price of survival. Her grandmother, the first Cleopatra, did not live long enough to be asked to give up a child at all. This one, the third, gave up a child and won by it. She was the first of the 6 to cross the line, the first to turn from a victim of the dynastic machine into an active instrument of it. In the year 127, Ptolemy VIII and Cleopatra III took Alexandria back, and the elder Cleopatra fled to Syria. 3 years later came the reconciliation we have already spoken about. She returned, and the three of them agreed to live together again. The documents of this period begin once more with 3 names: King Ptolemy, Queen Cleopatra, the sister, and Queen Cleopatra, the wife. Everything exactly as it had been. Except that now the palace smelled of something heavier than perfume. 2 women lived in it, who each remembered handing a child of the others over to death, and 1 man who had arranged it. 8 years passed like that. The elder Cleopatra died around the year 115, about a year after her brother husband. The younger, our Cleopatra III, was left alone on the throne. For the first time in her life, without her mother beside her. For the first time, without a husband. For the first time, the principal figure. She could finally rule alone. But the logic of the dynasty did not allow it. A queen cannot stand by herself. There must be a king beside her. The will of Ptolemy VIII had left the kingdom to Cleopatra III, together with whichever of their sons she chose. The elder son was to become her co-ruler. The younger was to have Cyprus. And here the 3rd act of this story begins. The one in which Cleopatra III becomes, for her own sons, exactly what her uncle and her mother had been for her. The elder son, Ptolemy IX Lathyros, was about 26. He was a tall, slow, silent man, very little like his father. He did not enjoy ceremony. He enjoyed hunting. He took no interest in affairs of state, and would happily have left them all to his mother if she had left him alone. But she did not. She began with small things. She forbade him to appoint advisers of his own. She read his decrees before he signed them. She required that he appear at ceremonies only in her company and with her name in front of his. On the coins, her portrait came first and his came second. In the documents, Queen Cleopatra and King Ptolemy, her son. He was a kind of appendix. The younger son, Ptolemy X Alexander, was different. Quick, ambitious, sharp-eyed. He lived on Cyprus as he had been told to, and he wrote to his mother. And he let it be understood that if she ever wanted to change the arrangement in Alexandria, he was ready. Over these same years, Cleopatra III had been arranging marriages for her daughters. The eldest, Cleopatra IV, she married briefly to her own son, Ptolemy IX, then broke that marriage up and pushed her out towards Syria. Tryphaena she married to a Seleucid. Selene she kept nearer to hand and married to Ptolemy IX in her sister's place. The lines branched outwards. Her blood was spreading across the Near East. In the year 107 before Christ, Cleopatra III made her move. She accused her elder son of an attempt on her life. It was the standard Ptolemaic accusation, quick, unsupported, impossible to disprove. She gathered the Alexandrian crowd. She showed the people a servant supposedly carrying poison, supposedly hired by Ptolemy IX. The crowd accepted the Queen's version. Ptolemy IX was stripped of the throne and driven out to Cyprus, where he would sit for the next 19 years. The younger son, Ptolemy X, came back from Cyprus and took the throne beside his mother. Now it was a new pair, the mother queen and the younger son king. The documents began with her name again. On the coins, her head came first again. Once again, she held the real power, and the young man beside her wore the crown. He was about 20, he accepted it obediently, for the time being. Another 11 years or so went by. Cleopatra III governed Egypt with a hard hand. She carried out a series of administrative reforms. She stabilized the economy. She took personal control of Cyprus. She fought on the southern frontiers. She kept the diplomatic threads of the whole eastern Mediterranean in her own fingers. But the elder son did not sit quietly on Cyprus. He established himself there as a king in his own right. He kept up contacts with the opposition in Alexandria. He never forgave his mother. He waited. And the younger son, Ptolemy X, who had been obedient at first, began over the years to tire of his mother's supervision. He was past 30 now. He had a wife of his own, Berenice III, the daughter of Ptolemy IX, which is to say, his own niece. He had children of his own. He wanted to be king rather than co-king under his mother. A shadow was growing between him and her, the same shadow that had once stood between her and Ptolemy IX. And in the year 101 before Christ, or within a few months of it, because the exact chronology here is unclear, something happened that the sources do not tell us directly, but that we can reconstruct from later references. Cleopatra III died, suddenly. She was about 60. She was in good health, energetic, in power, and then gone. Justin says it plainly. She was killed by her younger son, Ptolemy X Alexander. He had run out of patience. He gave the order to poison his own mother. Other sources are more careful and speak of a sudden death, an illness, natural causes. But the chronology says its own thing. Ptolemy X received full power immediately after her death. There was no investigation. Not a word of grief appears in his decrees. He simply began ruling alone. And so the circle closed. Cleopatra III agreed to the killing of a child in order to break her mother. Her own younger child killed her in order to be free of his mother's shadow. What she had done to Ptolemy Memphites came back to her through her second son. Her daughter, Cleopatra IV, the one she had pushed towards Syria, was by then already dead. She had been killed in Syria, in the temple of Apollo at Daphne 11 years earlier, on the orders of her own sister Tryphaena, who was the wife of her husband's enemy. That is the story of the 4th chapter. Another daughter, Selene, went on living in Syria, passing from one Seleucid king to the next. That belongs to the 4th chapter too, because her fate and Cleopatra IV's are tied together beyond untangling. The elder son, Ptolemy IX, would come back to Alexandria some years after his mother's death and sit on the throne again. He would live a long time yet. He would have a daughter, Berenice III, and his son, Ptolemy XII, nicknamed Auletes, the flute player, would father the 7th Cleopatra, the one sitting in the mausoleum in the year 30 before Christ. Which is to say that Cleopatra III is the direct great-grandmother of the 7th Cleopatra. Of the whole family line, their blood is the closest. What did Cleopatra III leave behind? She left a precedent. Before her, the women of the dynasty had ruled as co-queens, as regents, as wives. She was the first to rule as a genuinely independent queen, with her sons placed in the position of consorts. Her name came first in the documents, and that was new. Her portrait came first on the coins, and that was new. She showed that a woman among the Ptolemies could be the principal figure and not a decoration in the margin. That is the lesson her great-granddaughter would absorb 60 years later. She left another precedent as well, one her great-granddaughter would absorb too and use in her own way. A child is an instrument. A son can be exiled, accused, replaced with another. An alliance with your own child is a political alliance. It holds as long as it profits both of you. When it stops being profitable, it is dissolved. That is a brutal logic. Cleopatra VII, as we shall see, was not that cold. She loved her children. But the very possibility that a child could be a piece in the larger game was brought into the dynasty by Cleopatra III. And now she lies dead in the palace, somewhere in the year 101 before Christ, in all probability poisoned by her own son. She will be buried with every honour. Her name will not be erased. On the contrary, it will stand at the head of a great many documents after her death as a sacred figure. But in the palace, the smell of a mother's perfume will mix with the smell of poison, as it had done more than once before. And the young king, Ptolemy X, will sit on the throne alone at last, without his mother. And far to the north, in Syria, in the city called Antioch, in the very city the first Cleopatra had once come from, new blood was already growing. Two sisters, Selene and Cleopatra IV, who is dead now. Selene is still alive and has not finished her Syrian odyssey. Her story and what happened to her dead sister is the next chapter. Now the story leaves Egypt. It goes north, to two sisters, and to the sanctuary where one of them died. In this chapter we travel not south to Alexandria, but north into Syria, because the fate of the next two Cleopatras unfolded there, in the lands that had once belonged to the Seleucids, in the same lands the first Cleopatra had come from 100 years earlier. Now, at the end of the 2nd century before Christ, that journey was made in the opposite direction. Two daughters of Cleopatra III went north to Antioch. Each of them became a queen there. One of them had the other killed, and paid for it within a year. First, the world they arrived in. The Seleucid state, which had once stretched from the Aegean to the Hindu Kush, was by the end of the 2nd century before Christ a shadow of itself. It had lost Mesopotamia to the Parthians. It had lost Iran, where the Parthian kings now ruled in their own right. It had lost Asia Minor, where new kingdoms had grown up, Pergamon and Pontus. All that remained of the old empire was Syria, Antioch as the capital, the coast of the Levant, a piece of Cilicia, and a few inland towns. That was all. And even over that remnant, an endless civil war was being fought. The Seleucid dynasty had split. Two branches of descendants were at each other's throats. The sons of Antiochus VIII, nicknamed Grypus, the hook nose, and the sons of Antiochus IX, nicknamed Cyzicenus, the man from Cyzicus. The two of them were half-brothers. Antiochus VIII was the son of Demetrius II and Cleopatra Thea, the same daughter of Cleopatra II, who had lived out her own Syrian odyssey through 3 marriages. Antiochus IX was the son of Antiochus VII and that same Cleopatra Thea, by her second Seleucid marriage. 2 brothers from one mother and 2 different fathers, both of them Seleucid kings, from 2 different paternal lines. and they hated each other. Each considered himself the only lawful king of Syria. Each had his own capital, Grypus in Antioch, Cyzicenus at Damascus. Between them, a war had been running for years without a winner. Now, for the girls, Cleopatra III sent into that machinery of blood. The elder was Cleopatra IV. She was born around the year 138 before Christ. In about 119, she was married to her own elder brother, Ptolemy IX Lathyros. The marriage was meant to put the young king under a double control, his mother's and his wife's, the wife also being his sister. That was the classic Ptolemaic arrangement. But the marriage went wrong from the start. Ptolemy IX and Cleopatra IV lived together about 4 years. They had 2 children, a daughter named Cleopatra Berenice, and one more. And then Cleopatra III did the thing nobody had expected. She forced her son to divorce Cleopatra IV and marry the younger sister Selene, who was only just of marriageable age. Why did she do it? Because Cleopatra IV had turned out to be too independent. She sided with her husband too often instead of with her mother-in-law. She had begun assembling a following of her own in Alexandria. Cleopatra III realized that instead of an obedient instrument for controlling her son, she had created an alternative center of power, and she decided to remove it. Cleopatra IV was expelled from Alexandria. She went first to Cyprus, and from there, around the year 114, on to Syria. She was about 24. Without her children, who had not been allowed to leave with her and stayed with their father, without a court, without a dowry, or with very little, with nothing but the standing of a former queen of Egypt whose own mother had thrown her out. In Syria she found Antiochus IX Cyzicenus. He was in serious difficulty at the time. His half-brother, Antiochus VIII, Grypus, was pressing him hard from Antioch. He needed money, soldiers, allies. And here came a former queen of Egypt, in exile, but with a name, with Ptolemaic blood, with promises. He married her quickly. She became his queen. She had already sent word to Cyprus, where her personal reserves of money were held, money she had managed to get out of Alexandria. She had hired mercenaries there, a Cypriot force. She brought that force to Antiochus IX. It was a real military asset. Selene, the younger sister, was at that same moment sitting in Alexandria as the new wife of Ptolemy IX. She was about 17. Her mother, Cleopatra III, kept her in the palace and used her as an instrument of control over her son. Selene was obedient. She bore Ptolemy IX at least 2 sons. But it would only last a few years. In the year 107, as we remember from the last chapter, Cleopatra III removed Ptolemy IX from the throne and installed the younger son, Ptolemy X. Ptolemy IX was driven out. Selene was kept in Alexandria at first. Later, her fate would twist together with her sisters. But for now, back to Antioch. The war between the 2 Antiochuses went on. Antiochus IX, reinforced by Cleopatra IV's resources, went over to the attack. He advanced on Antioch. Antiochus VIII Grypus fled. Antiochus IX took the capital. This happened around the year 113 before Christ. Grypus did not accept it. He gathered new forces and came back. A new phase of the war began between the brothers. The city changed hands. At a certain point, in the year 112, Antiochus VIII Grypus took Antioch again. Antiochus IX got out in time. Cleopatra IV did not. She was left in the city. Or more precisely, she took refuge in the temple of Apollo in the suburb of Antioch that was called Daphne. It was a sacred suburb, full of temples and parks, famous across the whole Greek world. People went there to pray, to walk, to rest. In it stood the celebrated statue of Apollo by the sculptor Bryaxis, colossal in scale, which the Greeks regarded as one of the finest images of the god anywhere. Cleopatra IV ran into the temple. She wrapped her arms around the statue of Apollo. This was a standard practice of the ancient world. Anyone who touched the image of a god inside his own temple acquired sacred immunity. If a pursuer killed him there, he broke the will of the god and called down a curse on himself. It worked, most of the time. Suppliants in temples were not killed, not even enemies. Grypus had taken the city. His soldiers were moving through the suburbs. But the decision about Cleopatra IV was not made by him. It was made by his wife. His wife was Tryphaena, Cleopatra Tryphaena, another daughter of Cleopatra III, married to Antiochus VIII Grypus a few years earlier, which means that the full sister of Cleopatra IV was sitting on the throne in Antioch as Grypus's queen. And when her husband came back into the city and pushed Cyzicenus out, what he had captured was his own wife's sister. Grypus wanted to spare Cleopatra IV. He was a pragmatist. He understood that her death meant a quarrel with Egypt, and he did not want a quarrel with Egypt. He had quite enough quarrel with his brother. He wanted simply to expel her from Syria and send her back to her mother. He told his wife that his ancestors had never treated women that way, and that the temple she had fled to was sacred, and that he owed respect to the gods who had given him his victory. But Tryphaena refused. Why? Because to Tryphaena, Cleopatra IV was not a sister-in-law. She was the reason the war was still going. She had brought the money and the troops to Cyzicenus. She had given him the resource that let him take Antioch a few months earlier. Because of her, Tryphaena had herself once had to run from the city, hiding from her own sister's soldiers. Tryphaena had reasons to hate Cleopatra IV. And there was one more reason. She was pregnant. She was thinking about the fate of her unborn son in a world where her own sister might one day come back and bring another army. Tryphaena gave the order to kill Cleopatra IV in the temple, in the sanctuary of Apollo, right beside the statue of the god she was clinging to. The soldiers came into the temple. Cleopatra IV held the statue with both arms. She shouted prayers to Apollo. She shouted that she was the daughter of Ptolemy VIII, the granddaughter of Cleopatra I, that Apollo would not permit her to be killed. The soldiers hesitated at first. No Greek willingly wanted to kill inside a temple. It was against every rule they had. And then, as Justin and Appian tell it, Tryphaena came in herself. She ordered the soldiers to take Cleopatra IV by the arms and pull her off the statue. When she would not let go, they simply cut the hands away, first one, then the other. The hands stayed where they were, on the statue of Apollo, still clasped around the stone. The body of Cleopatra IV fell to the floor of the temple. They finished her there, on the marble, in front of the face of the god. A sister killed a sister in a holy place. It happened in the year 112 before Christ. Cleopatra IV was about 26 years old. She had lived through exile, a marriage, a war, and death at the hands of her own sister. The priesthood of Apollo pronounced the killing an abomination. The outrage travelled fast. It was talked about in every sanctuary of the god in the Greek world, because a suppliant had been cut down at the feet of the statue, and that was the one thing that was never supposed to happen. Tryphaena paid no attention. She was a queen, and she thought that made her untouchable. That was her mistake. Within a year, Antiochus IX Cyzicenus had gathered new forces and come back. He took Antioch a second time, in the year 111 before Christ. Antiochus VIII Grypus escaped. Tryphaena did not. She was seized. Antiochus Cyzicenus did not hesitate. He remembered how his wife Cleopatra IV had been killed in a temple. He ordered Tryphaena killed the same way, in a holy place, symbolically, as an offering in the name of the murdered woman. She was executed in one of the temples of Antioch. The sources do not name which one, but the symmetry was clear to everybody. So, within a single year, one of the 6 Cleopatras died at the hands of her own sister, and that sister was dead within 12 months of it. The elder in the temple of Apollo at Daphne, with her severed hands still on the statue. The younger in an act of retribution in a sanctuary just like it. Now the third sister comes onto the stage, Selene. In the year 107 before Christ, after Ptolemy IX had been removed from the throne of Alexandria, Selene was left in Alexandria with her young sons by him. Her mother, Cleopatra III, kept her in the palace. She was not a queen any more. Her former husband was in exile. She was simply a princess in her mother's palace. And then, around the year 102 before Christ, she was sent to Syria. To whom? To Antiochus VIII Grypus, to the very man whose previous wife, Tryphaena, had been executed by Antiochus IX for the murder of Cleopatra IV. Think about that arrangement. Selene arrived in Antioch as the wife of a man who had previously been married to her own sister Tryphaena. Her sister had killed another sister, Cleopatra IV, in the temple of Apollo. Her sister had been killed for it. And now she was taking that sister's place in the palace of the same man. She lived in the rooms Tryphaena had lived in. She slept in the bed Tryphaena had slept in. She walked the same corridors that had heard Tryphaena's last footsteps. Selene was close to 30 at the time. Nobody asked her consent. In this dynasty, nobody ever asked a daughter's consent. The marriage did not last long. In the year 96 before Christ, Antiochus VIII Grypus was murdered in a conspiracy at his own court got up by one of his generals, a man named Heraclion, who wanted the throne for himself. Selene was widowed about 6 years after arriving in Syria. And here begins the run of marriages that makes her story what it is. First, she married Antiochus IX Cyzicenus, the same man who had been her sister Cleopatra IV's first husband, the same man who had ordered the execution of her other sister Tryphaena, the same man through whom all of this blood had been spilled. It happened around the year 95 before Christ. She became the third wife of Antiochus IX, after her own sister and one other woman between them. Within about a year, Antiochus IX was killed in battle against Grypus's son Seleucus VI, who had come to avenge his father. Selene was widowed a second time. Then she married Antiochus X Eusebius, the son of that same Antiochus IX, which is to say, the stepson of her previous husband. He was young, ambitious, full of energy. She bore him 2 sons. One of them, Antiochus XIII, nicknamed Asiaticus, would become the last significant Seleucid king, would live into the 60s before Christ, and would be one of the hinge figures of the last years of Syria. Antiochus X was killed in war as well. Selene was widowed a third time. She was left with 2 small sons. She was left in a territory where the war between the Seleucid branches was still going, and where her own political allies were melting away. And then she did the thing only a Ptolemaic queen would have done. She took her sons and went south, down to the Phoenician coast. She seized a strong fortress, Ptolemaic, a city on the Levantine shore, and announced that she now ruled in the name of her elder son, on her own, as Queen Regent. She began striking coins with her portrait and her son's name, her head in profile in a diadem with the distinctive Ptolemaic nose she had inherited from her father, her head in front, her son's head behind. It repeated the strategy of her mother Cleopatra III in Alexandria. It repeated the strategy of her grandmother Cleopatra II. It repeated the strategy of her great-grandmother Cleopatra I. Every one of them at some point became a queen regent for a young son. Every one of them put her own name in front. Selene was doing exactly what all of her predecessors had taught her. So she ruled in Ptolemaic and the territory around it from roughly the 80s before Christ onwards, about 15 years of independent rule. She kept her sons with her. She taught the elder, the future Antiochus XIII, languages, history, diplomacy. She was preparing him for a throne. She believed that, at the right moment, he would become the new king of a reunited Syria, and she would be his queen mother, the way her great-grandmother Cleopatra I had once ruled in the name of the young Ptolemy VI. That right moment never came. By the year 69 before Christ, Selene was about 65. Her elder son was about 30. She was still sitting in Ptolemais, and then a man came onto the stage, whose name she may have heard as a child, but whom she had never met in person. Tigranes the Great, King of Armenia. Tigranes was a formidable man. He had brought almost everything left of the Seleucid state under his own control. He had taken Antioch back in the 80s. He had proclaimed himself king of Syria. He held that no Seleucid or Ptolemaic widow had any business claiming the Syrian throne. Selene was a bone in his throat, a living reminder that there was another legitimate line in Syria. He moved on Ptolemais. He besieged the city. The city fell after a siege of months. Selene was taken prisoner. Tigranes did not kill her at once. He carried her east with him, out of Syria, and had her held under guard. Why? The exact reason is not known. Some historians think he was using her as a hostage, as a bargaining piece in negotiations with the Romans who were already advancing against him. Some think he was simply waiting for her sons to make a mistake so that he would have a pretext for seizing them as well. In that same year, 69 before Christ, Selene was executed at Seleucia on the Euphrates. It was done on the order of Tigranes. Exactly how she died, the sources do not say. Some hint at strangling, others speak only of an execution without specifying the method. Her age at death was about 65. She lived one of the longest lives of any Cleopatra before the 7th. She outlived all of her sisters. She passed through 4 marriages, a regency, a siege, captivity, and a foreign executioner. Her elder son, Antiochus XIII, outlived his mother. He reached Antioch after the Romans broke Tigranes, and even held the Seleucid throne for a short time with the support of Lucullus. But a few years later, in the year 64 before Christ, the Roman general Gnaeus Pompey simply abolished the Seleucid state. He declared that Syria was now a Roman province. Antiochus XIII was killed by an Arab chieftain, Sampsicaramus of Emesa, by arrangement, as the story goes, with Rome. That was the end of Selene's line. The last son of 2 dynasties, Ptolemaic and Seleucid, died in a Syrian town 5 years after his mother. What do we know about Selene from the last years of her life? Very little. Her name appears on the coinage of Ptolemais. Her head appears on statues that have come out of excavations. Her name is mentioned in a few Roman references describing negotiations she conducted with Rome in an attempt to find support against Tigranes. She was the only one of the 6 Cleopatras who corresponded with Roman senators personally. She was the first of the family to understand that Rome was not one of the players. Rome was a separate level of politics altogether. That is the lesson her distant relative Cleopatra VII would absorb in the next generation, absolutely literally. Now look at the chronology. Selene was executed in 69 before Christ. The 7th Cleopatra was born in 69 before Christ, which means that the 5th Cleopatra died in the same year the 7th came into the world. This is not a distant past. These are contemporaries. 2 women with the same name, one of them old, a prisoner somewhere on the Euphrates, the other not yet born, still in her mother's body in Alexandria. One ends, the other begins. What did Selene leave behind? She left an example. She showed that a woman of the Ptolemaic dynasty could rule alone, without a husband, without a mother, without brothers, could conduct diplomacy with Rome in her own person, could hold a fortress against a powerful neighbour, could pass a throne to a son. All of that would be needed 1 generation later. And in Alexandria at that time, in the 70s before Christ, the 6th of the shadows was living out her short life, the 6th Cleopatra. Cleopatra the 6th Tryphaena. Hers is the shortest and the strangest story of all of them. and her riddle is the single most important piece of context for understanding what the seventh became. There are things in history we know a great deal about. There are things we know very little about. And there are things we know so little about that the absence itself becomes the subject. The sixth Cleopatra is the third kind. Her name appears in one line of a papyrus, in one inscription on the wall of a temple, in one passage of porphyry, and that is all. Not one portrait on a coin that can be confidently assigned to her. Not one description written in her lifetime of her face, her character, her voice. Not one word she ever said. Only a shadow. And to understand that shadow, you first have to understand what kind of Egypt she arrived in, or was born into, because we are not certain even of that. In the year 101 before Christ, as we remember from the third chapter, Cleopatra III died, possibly poisoned by her own son, Ptolemy X. He was left on the throne alone. He was about 30 years old. He ruled for the next 12 years without his mother, and they were 12 years of catastrophe. Ptolemy X Alexander turned out to be an even worse ruler than his father Ptolemy VIII. He was cruel, reckless, and extravagant. He loaded the population with taxes it could not carry. He confiscated temple treasures. He even plundered the tomb of Alexander of Macedon, the one that had stood at the center of Alexandria since the end of the 4th century. He replaced Alexander's golden sarcophagus with one of glass, and melted the gold down into coin to pay his own mercenaries. It was an act of sacrilege without precedent. The Alexandrians remembered it for a long time. If Ptolemy VIII went into history forever as potbelly and as a butcher, Ptolemy X went into history as the man who stole Alexander's gold. In the year 88 before Christ, the Alexandrians rose against him. He was thrown off the throne. He fled to Cyprus, tried to raise mercenaries, tried to come back, and was killed in a sea fight off the island. The throne went back to his elder brother, Ptolemy IX, the Thyros, who had spent the previous 19 years in exile. He was about 55 by then. He was tired, cautious, unambitious. He simply wanted to live out the rest of his life on the throne his own mother had once taken away from him. He lived another 8 years and died in the year 80 before Christ at about 63. It was only the second natural death of a Ptolemaic king in half a century after Ptolemy VIII. And here begins the sequence out of which the sixth Cleopatra grows. Ptolemy IX had children. As we remember from the last chapter, from his first marriage to Cleopatra IV came a daughter, Cleopatra Berenice, and one more child. From his second marriage to Selene came 2 sons, who, as small boys, had been sent out of Alexandria after their grandmother removed their father from the throne. Those sons were brought up on Kos, the Greek island where their grandmother had deposited them, along with part of the royal treasury. They grew up half foreign, half Alexandrian, and half islander. They had no experience of governing Egypt because they had never lived there as adults. The elder was called Ptolemy. The younger was called Ptolemy as well, because dynastic names did not change. When Ptolemy IX died in the year 80, the question of a successor arose. There were 2 lawful candidates. The first was Ptolemy XI, Alexander II, the son of the deposed Ptolemy X. This young man was living in Rome, where his father had once sent him as a hostage. He had spent many years in Rome, close to Sulla, and the dictator had effectively raised him as his own protégé. Sulla saw in him an instrument of influence over Egypt. The second candidate was the elder son of Ptolemy IX and Selene. In dynastic terms, he was the more legitimate heir, because his father had ruled to the very end. But he was on Kos, far away, without an army and without a court. And there was a third option, Cleopatra Berenice, the daughter of Ptolemy IX by his first marriage. She was in Alexandria. She was about 40. She was educated, level-headed, dignified. The Alexandrians were fond of her. The Council of Elders and the Assembly of Philosophers, which is roughly what passed for a senate in Alexandria, decided that she could be trusted with the throne. She began to rule alone, but Sulla sent instructions from Rome. He demanded that the Alexandrians accept his protégé, Ptolemy XI. He threatened military intervention if they refused. The Alexandrians agreed reluctantly, but on one condition. Ptolemy XI would have to marry Berenice III, who was already on the throne. Two co-rulers. He would become legitimate through marriage to her. Ptolemy XI arrived in Alexandria in the year 79 before Christ. He was about 30. He had been raised in Rome, which meant Roman manners, Roman bluntness, Roman contempt for Eastern custom. He did not understand Alexandria. He did not understand his bride, who was his first cousin once removed. The wedding took place. 19 days later, he killed her. The exact reason is unknown. Some sources say she obstructed his attempts to rule alone. Some say she despised him as a creature of Rome. Some say the two of them simply could not agree on the ordinary procedures. Who is received in audience? Whose portrait comes first on a coin? Which rite is performed in the temple? He strangled her in her own bedroom, or ordered her strangled. The sources give both versions. It was a catastrophe. Berenice III was Alexandria's favourite. Within a single day, the whole city knew that a Roman appointee had strangled their old queen on the 19th day of their marriage. The crowd came out into the streets. They marched to the palace. They dragged Ptolemy XI out of his rooms. They hauled him to the square in front of the gymnasium of Alexandria. There, on the steps of the gymnasium, they tore him to pieces. This happened in the year 79 before Christ. He had reigned 19 days, the shortest reign in the history of the dynasty. Now there was nobody on the throne. What next? The Alexandrians sent messengers to Kos, to the sons of Ptolemy IX and Selene. One of them was to become the new king. The elder was called Ptolemy, and they brought him to Alexandria. In the year 79 before Christ, he became Ptolemy XII. He was then somewhere between 30 and 35. The exact date of his birth is unknown. He arrived in Alexandria without a solid court, without confidence in his own authority, without any understanding of the intrigues of the capital. In the strict sense, he was illegitimate. Some of his contemporaries even called him Nothos, a bastard, because his mother, Selene, had no longer been formally the wife of Ptolemy IX at the moment of his birth. That doubt about his legitimacy followed him all his life. The Alexandrians accepted him, but without much respect. They gave him a nickname straight away, Auletes, the flute player, because he liked to play the flute, particularly during public festivals. He would appear in the temple of Dionysus in Bacchic costume, with a wreath of vine leaves on his head and a flute in his hands, and dance with the priests. The Alexandrians laughed at him to his face. He needed a wife. And not just a wife, but the kind of wife who would give him the legitimacy he was short of. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, only one thing conferred that legitimacy, and that was blood. He had to marry a direct heiress. And here our sixth Cleopatra walks onto the stage. Who was she? This is a question with no single answer in the historical literature. Before we go further, one thing has to be said plainly. The numbering of these queens, the fifth Cleopatra and the sixth Cleopatra, is a modern invention, and historians still argue about whether these are two women or one. There are three main versions. Version 1. She was his full sister, that is, the second daughter of Ptolemy IX and Selene. Some contemporaries write of her as his sister and wife, which is the standard Ptolemaic formula. In this case, she came from Kos together with her brother and married him after his coronation. Version 2. She was his half-sister, the daughter of Ptolemy IX by another woman he had with him in exile on Kos, possibly a concubine. In that case, she had a claim to Ptolemaic blood through her father, but not through her mother. Version 3, the most radical. That Cleopatra VI Tryphaena is not a separate woman at all, but a second name for the same Cleopatra V, who is mentioned as the wife of Ptolemy XII. In other words, a separate sixth Cleopatra never existed. It is simply a confusion in the sources between several records of one person. Modern historians lean mostly towards the first or the second version, because one papyrus fragment mentions at the same time a king Ptolemy and a queen Cleopatra, his sister and wife, with the epithet Tryphaena, which means the luxurious or the wealthy. The name Tryphaena had appeared in the dynasty before. It was carried by a daughter of Cleopatra III, the one who killed Cleopatra IV in the Temple of Apollo. Now that name appears again on a new generation. Whoever she was, in the year 79 before Christ, Ptolemy XII married her. She became his queen. Her name was written on official documents beside his. On a stele from the temple at Philae, set up in the year 70 before Christ, there is a dedication from King Ptolemy and Queen Cleopatra Tryphaena, his sister and wife. And then she disappears. Somewhere between the years 69 and 67 before Christ, her name stops appearing in the documents. It simply stops. Ptolemy XII stays on the throne. He goes on signing decrees. But there is no queen mentioned beside him anymore. The documents of those years carry only his name. In the sanctuaries, only his offerings. On the coins, only his profile. What happened? Again, three main versions. The first, she died, possibly in childbirth, possibly of illness, possibly of poison. Ptolemy XII buried her, but without particular honours and without an official period of mourning, which is why we have no record of a funeral. The second, she was divorced or exiled. This is less likely, because in the Ptolemaic dynasty, a divorce from your own sister is effectively impossible. It destroys the whole dynastic logic. But some historians point to a possible conflict between Ptolemy and his wife, perhaps over the influence of Roman agents at court, perhaps over tax policy, perhaps over the king's children by other women. In that case, she could simply have been removed from sight, sent off to one of the desert temples to live as a priestess with no possibility of returning to the palace. The third, she was killed. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, that was not an exceptional event. It is possible Ptolemy XII had her eliminated himself, the way his great-grandfather, Ptolemy VIII, had eliminated a son and sent him in a chest. It is possible she was eliminated by enemies inside the palace, by a faction that wanted the king married to a different woman. However she vanished, her disappearance coincides in time with one important event. In about the year 69 before Christ, a daughter was born in the palace of Ptolemy XII. They named her Cleopatra, the seventh of that name, the same one who is sitting in the mausoleum in the year 30 before Christ. Her mother was Cleopatra VI Tryphaena, or was not. Here is another riddle. In the documents of the 70s, Ptolemy XII is mentioned as the father of several children. The eldest daughter, Berenice IV. The second, Cleopatra VII. The youngest, Arsinoe IV. Two sons, both later Ptolemies, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV. Which of them had which mother, the sources contradict each other. Berenice IV was certainly the daughter of Cleopatra VI, and several inscriptions confirm it. Cleopatra VII was probably her daughter as well, but some sources name another woman, a second wife of Ptolemy XII, whose name has not survived. The younger children, Arsinoe, Ptolemy XIII, and Ptolemy XIV, most likely came from that second woman. So the sixth Cleopatra, Tryphaena, may have been the mother of the seventh, or may not. That is how close we are standing to the figure our whole story depends on, and how uncertainly we know her name. And this is not an accident. It is not carelessness on the part of the ancient writers, it is a system. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, women were forgotten systematically. Men were numbered, Ptolemy I, the second, the third, the fourth, all the way to the 15th. Each was given an epithet: Soter, Philadelphus, Euergetes, Philopator, Epiphanes, Philometor, Euergetes II, Soter II, Alexander, Alexander II, Auletes. Each was given a biography. Each was shown on coins with his name beneath him. Women were not numbered. Modern historians invented the numbering of the Cleopatras only in the 19th century, in order to find their way through the confusion. The ancient sources simply wrote, Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt. If there were several in one generation, they added an epithet: Tryphaena, Selene, Berenice, Thea. But those epithets are not always unique. Often the same name passed from a mother to a daughter, from an aunt to a niece. In one generation there could be two Cleopatra Tryphaenas. Across two generations, three Cleopatra Selenes. This created confusion even in antiquity. Strabo could mix up two women called Berenice. Polybius could mix up two Arsinoes. Justin could mix up two Cleopatras. And when, 500 years later, medieval copyists were reproducing these texts, the errors accumulated. Names blurred into each other. Epithets moved around. Texts have come down to us in which a name in one manuscript is a different name in another manuscript of the very same text. If you are a woman among the Ptolemies, your biography depends on which of your sons history remembered. If your son was famous, something will be written about you as his mother. If your son was an ordinary king, or died in childhood, your name disappears along with him. The sixth Cleopatra was queen for only a few years. Possibly she died young. Possibly the son who would have carried her name was never born at all. In any case, nobody was left who could put her into the Roman record, and so she was erased. That is the most unsettling discovery in this whole story. Not that 6 Cleopatras died by poison in temples under the knife. Not that they were handed over at 11 years old to foreign kings. It is that even the bloodiest death leaves traces. A life simply wiped out leaves nothing. The 6th Cleopatra left behind nothing but a shadow in one papyrus and an epithet in one inscription. Perhaps she lived a long and quiet life. Perhaps she was strangled in a room. We do not know. History threw her away. And it is inside that shadow, in that empty place in the palace, at that unmarked grave, or absence of a grave, that a girl is growing. The one born in the year 69 before Christ, in a palace where her mother, or not her mother, had recently disappeared. Her father is the flute player, the man the whole of Alexandria laughed at. Her elder sister is Berenice IV, who already understands the intrigues of the court. Her younger sister Arsinoe is not born yet, or is still an infant. 2 small brothers, both Ptolemies, are somewhere with their nurses. This girl, before she could even speak, was already living in a palace where almost nothing was left of the previous generation. She was the 6th Cleopatra only by counting, the 7th by name, but the 1st in a new world. A world in which the Seleucid Empire had already fallen apart, in which Syria belonged to Rome, in which the main politics of the Mediterranean was decided in a senate 1,000 miles from her father's palace. A world her predecessors had never known. And she would have to survive in that new world with 6 examples in front of her of how to survive in the old one. 6 strategies, 6 deaths. Her childhood is the next chapter. A childhood under a roof from which you could see the library, the lighthouse, and the Roman galleys in the harbour all at once. A childhood in which her father danced in a Bacchic wreath, her sister was planning a coup, her mother was possibly lying in an unmarked grave, and she herself already knew, though she could not yet have put it into words, that being the 7th with that name meant either becoming the 1st in a new reality or becoming the last, like all the women before her. Alexandria, the year 69 before Christ. The city stands on 2 narrow strips of land between the Mediterranean and Lake Mareotis. On the eastern strip is the royal quarter, which the Alexandrians call the Brucheion. In it are the palaces, the tomb of Alexander, the great library, the Museion, the royal gardens. all of that crowded ground, 1 kilometre long and half a kilometre wide, holds the royal family, several thousand courtiers, several thousand scholars, and tens of thousands of servants. On the western strip is the old Egyptian town of Rakotis, where the Egyptians live and where the temples of Serapis and Anubis stand. Between the two strips runs the main street, 30 metres wide, laid out by Alexander himself. They call it the Canopic Way. Every procession passes along it, religious, royal, and funeral. In one of the palaces of the Brucheion, that year, a girl was born. We do not know the exact date. Modern historians put it somewhere between January and the spring of 69. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, had been on the throne about 11 years. Her mother, as we discussed in the last chapter, was either Cleopatra VI Tryphaena or another woman whose name has not survived. They named her Cleopatra, the seventh of that name. Her title in the official documents would be Philopator, the one who loves her father, and later Philopatris would be added, the one who loves her country. But on the day she was born, she had no epithet at all. She was simply a newborn daughter of the king. Other children of Ptolemy XII were already living in the palace. The eldest daughter, Berenice IV, who was about 10. Possibly another daughter whose name has not survived. The ones younger than Cleopatra would come later. Arsinoe IV, born around 65, and two sons, Ptolemy XIII, born around 61, and Ptolemy XIV, born around 59. So Cleopatra was the second or third child in a large family, with a role of her own in the dynastic arithmetic that nobody had yet assigned. The first years of her life pass in the children's quarters of the royal palace. It is a separate complex, with its own inner courtyard, its own garden, its own small pool. The small princes and princesses have nurses attached to them, mostly Greek women from provincial families who came to Alexandria for work. They have tutors, also Greeks, but from a higher class, often former students of the Museion who made a living by teaching. They have servants, mostly Egyptians and Nubians, who clean, cook, and carry the children about the garden. In those first years, Cleopatra does not yet know that she is a queen. She has not yet been taught the history of the dynasty. She has not yet been walked into the official halls. She has not yet been dressed in ceremonial clothes. She plays on mats in the nursery. She eats from clay bowls. She sleeps on a mattress of lamb's wool under a linen cover. Her childhood is quiet, ordinary, much like the childhood of any wealthy Alexandrian girl. But she hears things. Children always hear more than adults think. She hears the nurses whisper that there is no queen in the palace, that her mother is dead or gone or sent away. She hears the servants speak about the elder princess, meaning Berenice, in a tone with fear in it, because Berenice at 10 is already showing her character. She hears the tutors discussing the news from Rome in Greek, on the assumption that a child does not understand. In Rome that year, the consuls are Hortensius and Metellus. In Rome that year, the third war against Mithridates, king of Pontus, is being fought. In Rome that year, the Senate is deciding what to do about Syria, where Antiochus XIII is still sitting, the son of Selene, and by most reconstructions, her father's own half-brother. Cleopatra grows. At 5, she begins learning her letters. At 6, she begins on Greek literature. Homer first, then Hesiod, then the tragedians. At 7, she begins on languages. This is not ordinary schooling. It is a program designed for a future queen. Her father understands that daughters can become instruments of policy, and he invests real resources in their upbringing. With languages, she turns out to have a rare gift. Her first language is, of course, Greek, in the household version of Alexandrian Koine. The second is Latin, because there are Roman envoys and officers in the palace at all times. The third is Egyptian. And here begins the first serious departure of Cleopatra from dynastic tradition. Plutarch says that scarcely any of the Ptolemies before her had trouble to learn Egyptian at all. 250 years of rule, and almost none of them bothered. The Greeks governed Egyptians through interpreters. Greek was the language of the court, of the administration, of literature. Egyptian was the language of the people and of the temples, but a king and queen were under no obligation to speak it. Why did she begin to learn it? Here the sources give no direct answer. Plutarch, writing more than a century later, describes her gift for languages with admiration, but he does not explain the motive. Modern historians suspect the initiative came from the Egyptian priesthood. In the Ptolemaic dynasty, the priests played an important role. They were the intermediaries between the royal court and the Egyptian population, and they carried real weight in the coronation rituals. It is possible that several of them, seeing the state of the dynasty, decided to raise the next generation differently. One of the high priests of Ptah at Memphis, Ptah III, was personally known to Ptolemy XII. It is possible, though no source says so, that it was he who insisted the king's children learn Egyptian. By 9 or 10, Cleopatra is fluent in 3 languages. By her early teens, according to the later tradition, she has added several more. Aramaic, the language of the eastern provinces and the caravan trade. Syriac, the language of the towns of the Levant, where her great-grandmother came from. Ethiopian, the language of Egypt's southern neighbours, of the kingdom of Kush, with whom the Ptolemies traded in gold and ivory. Persian, the language of the Parthian kingdom that had replaced Alexander's empire in the east. 7 languages before she was grown. By her middle teens, the tradition adds 2 more. Median, the language of the northern regions of the old Persian Empire. Troglodyte, the language of the nomad peoples of the Red Sea coast, with whom the Ptolemies traded in incense and spice. 9 languages. The 10th, Arabic, she would add later. That would be at the beginning of her adult life. Plutarch writes that she was the only one of the Ptolemies who could speak to every envoy in his own language. He writes that this made her exceptional at international receptions, that other Eastern monarchs, who could only speak through interpreters, felt provincial in front of her. She entered every culture through its voice. But languages are only one part of her education. The other part is the Museion. It is the most remarkable centre of learning in the ancient world. Founded by Ptolemy I Soter and expanded by Ptolemy II Philadelphus, the Museion in her childhood was not what it had been a century before. Many of its leading scholars had left in the reigns of Ptolemy VIII and Ptolemy X, who persecuted intellectuals. But some stayed, and some came back after Ptolemy IX restored the old tolerant policy. In the Museion, there were lectures in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, philology, grammar, and rhetoric. The lectures were attended not only by members of the Museion, but by outside students. The young Cleopatra, according to later sources, attended those lectures, at first with her tutors and later on her own. What did she study there? Modern researchers suspect two fields interested her particularly. The first was medicine. Later sources attribute to her treatises on medicine, cosmetics, the making of perfume, and systems of weights. Some of those treatises are forgeries of a later date, but some are supported by cross-references in ancient medical writers. She was interested in the body, in remedies, in poisons. That is not an accidental interest. In a dynasty where poison was a normal instrument, every woman had to know how it worked. Her great-grandmother, Cleopatra III, according to Justin, was also an expert in poisons. That knowledge was handed down in the family like a trade. The second field was astronomy and geography. Alexandria at that time was the center of mathematical geography in the world. 2 centuries before Cleopatra, Eratosthenes had measured the circumference of the earth here, to within a few percent. In the Museion, there were maps of the whole known world, from the British Isles to Ceylon. The young Cleopatra learned geography as a queen learns it, as somebody who has to know her empire and its borders. By her early teens, she knew where Parthia lay, where Axum lay, where Rome lay, how many days it was to sail from Alexandria to Athens, and how many weeks to Carthage. And alongside that intellectual education went another, no less important, an education in the history of her own dynasty. Somebody, most likely her chief tutor, walked her through the halls of the palace where the portraits of the earlier Ptolemies and their wives were hung. Somebody explained to her who each of them was. Somebody showed her her great-grandmother Cleopatra III on her portrait, with the distinctive nose in a diadem. Somebody showed her her great-great-grandmother Cleopatra II, a hard face, thin lips, a look in which you can already see the banquet with the dismembered son in it. Somebody showed her Cleopatra I, young, handsome, still without lines in her face, because her portrait was painted when she arrived from Antioch. We can only imagine what the tutor said when the child asked her questions. "Who is this?" "This is your great-grandmother, the first Cleopatra." "What happened to her?" "She died young, as regent for her own son." "Who is this?" "This is Cleopatra II, your great-great-grandmother." "What happened to her?" "She lived a long life." "Who is this?" "This is Cleopatra III." "What happened to her?" "Her son may have poisoned her." Conversations of that kind, going on for years, would build a picture in a girl's mind. She was the 7th. Before her there had been 6. Each of the 6 had her own name, her own face, her own death. Not one of them died in bed of old age, except Cleopatra II. Some were killed in temples, some by a cup of wine, some by the hands of their own family. Every one of them died earlier than she meant to. A child who absorbs that begins to count. At 6, Cleopatra may not yet have understood what it meant. At 8, she was beginning to. At 10, she certainly knew. At 12, she was beginning to think about how to avoid it. That leads us to the second great feature of her character. The first is her many languages and her learning. The second is strategic thinking, built on the negative example of the women who came before her. During this period, in her early youth, the palace had its own politics, part of which entered her awareness directly and part of it sideways. In the year 65 before Christ, when she was about 4, a delegation from Alexandria arrived in Rome. It was sent by the Alexandrian factions who were working against Ptolemy XII. He was unpopular because of the taxes, because of his weakness before Rome, because of the public performances in Bacchic costume. The delegates asked the Senate to depose Auletes and put somebody else on the throne. The Senate listened but did not act. Ptolemy XII paid the senators a great deal of money to leave him alone. That was his first precedent. He had begun buying Rome. In the year 64, Pompey completed the liquidation of the Seleucid kingdom. He made Syria a Roman province. Antiochus XIII, the son of Selene, and by most reconstructions her father's half-brother, was removed from the throne. A few years later, he was killed. The Syrian branch of her family was finished for good. In the year 59, when Cleopatra was 10, Julius Caesar, as consul in Rome, approved an agreement with Ptolemy XII. For 6,000 talents in cash, Ptolemy bought from Rome official recognition as friend and ally of the Roman people. That meant the Senate guaranteed his throne. But 6,000 talents was a sum equal to the entire annual revenue of Egypt. Ptolemy had to raise taxes to an impossible level. The Alexandrians began to grumble again. In the year 58, when Cleopatra was 11, Rome annexed Cyprus. It was one of the most valuable Ptolemaic possessions, an island of vineyards, copper mines, and trading ports. Cyprus at that time was ruled by Cleopatra's paternal uncle, Ptolemy of Cyprus, the brother of Ptolemy XII. When the Romans came, Ptolemy of Cyprus could not resist. He took poison and killed himself. Ptolemy XII in Alexandria said nothing. He did not speak up for his brother. He sent no troops. He declared no mourning. He simply accepted the fact. Rome does what it likes, and my task is to survive. The Alexandrians did not forgive him. In the winter of 58 to 57, they rose against him. Ptolemy XII fled Alexandria. He went to the island of Rhodes, and from there to Rome, to look for Roman military help in getting his throne back. Who did he take with him? By most reconstructions, he took Cleopatra. That is the moment her childhood ends. She was about 11. She left Alexandria, her sisters, her palace, her tutors. She was travelling with her father into exile. Why did he choose her? The elder daughter, Berenike IV, was already grown, about 21, and she stayed in Alexandria, where the Alexandrians immediately proclaimed her the new queen. The younger children, Arsinoe and the 2 boys, were far too small for a sea voyage. Cleopatra was exactly the right age. Old enough to survive the journey and be present at official meetings, young enough not to be a threat to her father herself in the way an elder daughter could be. The journey took several weeks, first to the island of Rhodes, where they stayed for a while. There, Ptolemy XII met Roman senators and learned the current situation in Rome. Then by ship to Italy. They landed at Brundisium, the port in the south. From there, overland to Rome. What did an 11-year-old girl see on that journey? She saw the Mediterranean for the first time from the open sea, not from the harbour of Alexandria, but out in deep water. She saw the coasts of Crete, of the Peloponnese, of southern Italy. She saw cities she had previously known only from the maps in the Museion. She saw her father in a new role, not a king on a throne, but a supplicant travelling to bow before a foreign senate. That was an important lesson. A king can be in a humiliating position. That, too, is part of the job. She spent 2 years in Rome. This was the second unofficial part of her education. The first part was the Museion and knowledge from books. The second was Rome, live, with its senators, its triumphs, its forum, its gladiatorial games, its intrigues, its purchasable courts. She was looking at a city that was still a republic and already knew its own strength. She saw how Roman politics actually worked, through connections, through money, through blackmail, through the favour of individual senators, through the crowds on the forum. She was a child in the household of a bankrupt king, and she was watching the men her father had to deal with. Among their names were Pompey, Caesar, Cicero, Cato the Younger. None of those men knew that in 19 years' time they would each, in one way or another, have to deal with her personally. But she already knew their names. In the year 55 before Christ, when Cleopatra was about 14, her father finally found a Roman commander willing to put him back on his throne. That commander was Aulus Gabinius, proconsul of Syria. For an enormous sum of money, 10,000 talents, another year's wealth of Egypt, Gabinius agreed to march his legions to Alexandria. The campaign took several months. Gabinius moved south from Palestine. He took one city after another. Falling back in front of him were the Alexandrian forces, commanded by Berenice IV and her second husband, Archelaus. Yes, in this period, Berenice married twice. The first time to a Seleucid prince whose name the sources give differently. That husband, they write, was so unpleasant, fat, coarse, and badly brought up that Berenice had him killed within a few days of the wedding. The second time to Archelaus, whose name and appearance were both considerably better. It was with him that she fought against her father's return. Gabinius came up to Alexandria. Archelaus was killed in the fighting. Berenice IV was captured and brought to her father. He did not hesitate. He ordered her executed at once. The order was carried out by one of Gabinius's Roman officers. Berenice IV was 23 years old. She was Cleopatra's elder sister. She was executed on the order of their father. Serving in Gabinius's army was a young Roman officer, a cavalryman, a squadron commander. He was about 28. His name was Marcus Antonius. He was among the first to fight his way into Alexandria. According to some accounts, he objected to the execution of Berenice and asked that she be spared. But her father would not listen. It was his first encounter with the palace of the Ptolemies. In that same palace, at that moment, is the 14-year-old daughter, Cleopatra. Did the two of them meet in person then? There is no ancient source that says so, and later writers have simply assumed it. But if they did meet, it was an accidental meeting, with no hint at all of what it would turn into 14 years later. Cleopatra came into Alexandria with her father. She saw the body of her elder sister, laid out in a room of the palace where the two of them had once played. She saw her father move through those rooms with an empty face, giving orders for the purge of Berenice's supporters. Hundreds of people were executed over the following months. This is what is called a restoration, and it costs a great many lives. Now Cleopatra is 14. She is the eldest of all the surviving children of Ptolemy XII. Her mother is in a grave somewhere, or in no grave at all. Her elder sister has just been executed. Her younger sister and brothers, Arsinoe, Ptolemy XIII, and Ptolemy XIV, look at her as the new eldest. Her father, worn out and politically broken, is afraid above all of another rising like the last one, and so he keeps Cleopatra beside him as the one person he thinks he can trust. From that moment she begins to learn not in theory, but in practice. She is present at the meetings of the royal council. She receives envoys from Cyrenaica and from Kush. She goes through the tax reports prepared for her father. She is no longer a child in the nursery. She is the king's apprentice. 4 years pass like that. Her father is slowly dying, of illness, of exhaustion, of the drinking he took up again after his return to the throne. In the year 51 before Christ, when Cleopatra is 18, he dies. In his will, he left the throne to Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy XIII, who was about 10. Brother and sister were to rule together as co-monarchs in the classic Ptolemaic tradition. Ancient writers also call them husband and wife in the usual formula, though many modern historians doubt any real marriage between them ever took place. That is the moment her childhood ends completely. That is the moment the period begins that Roman historians will call the Alexandrian War, the civil war of the Ptolemies, her relationship with Caesar, her relationship with Antony. That is the period everybody knows. That period is not our subject. Our subject is what she carried with her into that moment, what she walked onto the throne with at 18. She walked in with 9 languages in her head. She walked in with the Museum and with every corridor of the palace. She walked in with 2 years of Roman politics, with its faces and its voices. She walked in with the memory of 6 predecessors, each with her strategy and each with her death. She walked in with the example of an elder sister executed on their father's order. She walked in with a lethal understanding that neither a brother husband, nor a full sister, nor even a father is any guarantee of her life. The guarantee is herself, her own hands, her own mind, her own allies. And she walked in with one thing more, something none of her 6 predecessors had put into words in quite this form, but that was dissolved in the whole history of the dynasty. Rome is not one of the players on the board. Rome is the board. Any policy of Egypt in her time is a policy about Rome. If you want to rule, you must have a Roman patron. Her great-grandmothers solved that through marriages with Seleucids. She would solve it through Romans. And the last chapter is about how she did it. In the year 51 before Christ, Cleopatra VII became Queen of Egypt at the age of 18, the same age at which her great-grandmother, Cleopatra III, had become the second wife of Ptolemy VIII. Not the age at which her great-great-great-grandmother, Cleopatra I, came to the throne of Egypt, because that girl was handed over in marriage at 11. But it turned out not to be enough. Within a year, her younger brother's advisers, the eunuch Pothinus, the general Achillas, and the tutor Theodotus, had pushed her out of Alexandria. They wanted to rule through a boy of 11, not through a grown woman with a mind of her own. Cleopatra fled, and here she did what none of the 6 before her had done. She did not go to a foreign king to marry him. She did not sit in a temple asking a god for protection. She went to Syria, to the eastern frontier, and raised an army of her own. She hired Arab and Jewish mercenaries. She came back to the Egyptian border and stood at Pelusium with an army facing her brother's army. It repeated Selene's precedent, the woman who, from a fortress at Ptolemais, had held a stretch of the Syrian coast with troops of her own. But Selene had done it at 50. Cleopatra did it at 20. And then the outside world came in. Julius Caesar had crossed the Rubicon in January of the year 49 before Christ. In August of 48, he destroyed Pompey's army at Pharsalus in Thessaly. Pompey fled. He ran to Egypt because Egypt owed him. It was Pompey who had once helped Ptolemy XII, and Pompey who had guaranteed the agreements with Rome. Ptolemy XIII's advisers took a decision that has come down as one of the coldest calculations in ancient politics. They decided that Pompey was a loser and Caesar was a winner, and that Egypt should present the winner with a gift. When Pompey's ship approached the shore at Pelusium, a small boat came out to meet him. He was told he was being taken to the king. He got into the boat. As he was stepping onto the beach, he was stabbed in the back. His head was cut off and preserved for Caesar. Caesar arrived in Alexandria at the beginning of October in the year 48 before Christ. He came with 2 legions in pursuit of Pompey, expecting to have to fight him for a long time yet. He was 52 years old. He was met on the quay by the advisers of Ptolemy XIII, who presented him with a basket. In the basket was the head of Pompey. Caesar wept. That is what the sources say, and there is no reason to doubt it. Pompey had once been his son-in-law, married to Caesar's daughter, Julia. They had been allies for years before they became enemies. Caesar had been intending to pardon him because his policy of clemency towards defeated opponents was one of the foundations of his position, and the Egyptians had deprived him of that. They had turned a Roman civil war into a squalid murder on a beach. Caesar took the head and had it buried with honour. Then he moved into the royal palace and announced that he would settle the dispute between Ptolemy XIII and Cleopatra himself, as consul of the Roman people and as the guarantor of the treaty their father had signed. Cleopatra was outside Alexandria at that moment with her army. She could not enter the city because the harbour and the gates were held by her brother's troops. And she did the thing everybody knows. She had herself brought into the palace secretly, wrapped in bedding or in a sack for carpets, carried on the shoulder of a single trusted merchant named Apollodorus of Sicily. She was unrolled in front of Caesar in his own quarters. Think about that moment through the eyes of a 21-year-old woman. She has 9 languages in her head, including Latin, which means she can speak to Caesar directly with no interpreter. She has 2 years of watching Roman politics from inside a Roman house. She has the memory of 6 predecessors, and she has worked out where each of them went wrong. She has the understanding that Rome is not a player, but the board itself. And she has in front of her the single most powerful Roman alive. The Alexandrian War followed. Ptolemy XIII's advisors understood what had happened and attacked. Caesar was besieged in the palace quarter with about 3,000 legionaries. The war lasted 6 months and was very nearly the end of him. At one point, he had to swim several hundred meters across open water, holding his papers above the surface with one hand while he swam with the other. The Alexandrian docks were burned, and some ancient writers report that the fire reached the bookstores near the harbour, though how much of the library was lost is still argued over. In the year 47, the war ended. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while trying to escape. Cleopatra, at 22, became Queen of Egypt. Formally, alongside her surviving younger brother Ptolemy XIV, who was about 12, in practice, alone. She was also pregnant. In June of 47, she bore a son. She named him Ptolemy Caesar. The Alexandrians called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar stayed in Egypt for some months more. There was a journey up the Nile, which the ancient tradition describes as a royal progress on a great fleet of ships. How much of that account is ceremony, and how much is later decoration, we cannot now separate. She showed him the pyramids at Giza, which were already 2,500 years old when they saw them. She showed him Thebes and Karnak. She showed him the country she governed, and she showed him that governing it was a serious business and not a provincial hobby. It was the most effective piece of political persuasion of her life. In the year 46, Caesar went back to Rome. Later, Cleopatra came to Rome herself with Caesarion and stayed in Caesar's house on the right bank of the Tiber in the gardens across the river. Roman society was scandalized. Cicero wrote to Atticus that he detested the queen. A foreign monarch with a child she claimed was Caesar's living openly in his gardens while he had a Roman wife in the city was more than the Republic could digest. In March of the year 44, Caesar was murdered in the Senate. Cleopatra left Rome within weeks. Her position had collapsed overnight. Back in Alexandria, her brother and co-ruler Ptolemy XIV died soon afterwards. He was about 15. The suddenness of it produced immediate suspicion, and the suspicion has never gone away. In his place, she had Caesarion proclaimed co-ruler as Ptolemy XV. He was 3 years old. Caesar's will did not name Caesarion. It named Gaius Octavius, his great-nephew, an 18-year-old whom almost nobody in Rome had heard of. He took Caesar's name. He became, in time, Augustus. And from that moment, he and Caesarion were 2 boys who could not both exist, because each of them was Caesar's son, and only one could be. In the year 42, the murderers of Caesar were destroyed at Philippi in Macedonia by Mark Antony and Octavian. The second triumvirate, formed the year before between Antony, Octavian and Lepidus, now divided the Roman world between them. Antony took the east, which meant that Egypt was in his half. He was about 42. He was a big man, physically strong, a good soldier, popular with his troops, generous, loud, fond of wine and of company. He was not a subtle politician. He was the sort of man who ruled by presence rather than by calculation. In the year 41, he summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in Cilicia to answer for having supported the wrong side during the civil war. It was a summons to a hearing, a Roman commander calling an Eastern monarch to account. She came, but not as a defendant. She sailed up the river Cydnus in a ship with a gilded stern and purple sails. The oars were sheathed in silver and moved to the rhythm of flutes and harps. She lay on deck beneath a canopy embroidered with gold, dressed as Aphrodite, and boys dressed as Cupids fanned her, while women dressed as sea nymphs handled the ropes. The banks filled with people. By the time the ship reached Tarsus, the entire city had come down to the water, and Antony was sitting alone in the marketplace, waiting for a defendant who had turned herself into a goddess, arriving by river. Antony was waiting for her at the palace, where he had a public audience arranged. She did not come. She sent him an invitation to dinner on her ship. He came. That first evening decided everything. Within a week, Antony was in love. Within a month, he had gone with her to Alexandria. Within a year, she bore twins, a boy and a girl, whom they named Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Helios, the sun, Selene, the moon. She named her daughter after her own grandmother, that same Selene whom Tigranes the Great had executed at Seleucia on the Euphrates 29 years earlier. The name came back into the dynasty after one generation. Selene's blood, running through Antiochus XIII, had been cut off with his death. The blood of the seventh Cleopatra, running through her newborn daughter Selene, was meant to go on, as a hope. It is worth stopping here and looking at what has repeated. Every one of the 6 women before her had at some point tied herself to an outside power to hold on to her throne. The first married the enemy's son. The second called in a Seleucid son-in-law. The third worked the Roman Senate from Cyprus. The fourth bought an army with Cypriot money. The fifth negotiated with Roman commanders from a fortress on the coast. The sixth, if she existed at all, was a piece in her brother's legitimacy. And the seventh did the same thing, only at the scale the new world required. She did not marry a neighbouring king. She attached herself to the 2 most powerful men in the Mediterranean, one after the other. It was the same strategy her family had used for 2 centuries. Only the map had changed. In the year 34 before Christ, in Alexandria, Antony staged the ceremony that history calls the Donations of Alexandria. On a silver platform in front of the whole city, he seated Cleopatra on a golden throne as Queen of Kings, and Caesarion beside her as King of Kings. Alexander Helios, aged 6, was proclaimed King of Armenia, Media, and Parthia. His twin sister, Cleopatra Selene, was proclaimed Queen of Cyrenaica and Crete. Ptolemy Philadelphus, aged 2, was given Syria and Cilicia. Most of these territories did not belong to Antony to give. Rome understood exactly what it was watching. A Roman commander had handed Roman provinces to the children of a foreign queen, and had publicly recognized Caesarion as the son of Julius Caesar, which made Octavian's whole position an inheritance from a man whose real son was alive in Alexandria. Octavian used it. He used it for 2 years, patiently and expertly. In the year 32, the Senate declared war. Not on Antony, which would have made it another civil war, but on Cleopatra, a foreign queen threatening Rome. It was a masterpiece of presentation, and it worked. Octavian had also seized Antony's will from the Temple of the Vestal Virgins and read it aloud in the Senate. In it, Antony asked to be buried in Alexandria beside Cleopatra. For Rome, that was the end of him. A Roman consul who wanted to lie in an Egyptian tomb was no longer a Roman. On the 2nd of September, in the year 31 before Christ, the 2 fleets met off the promontory of Actium in western Greece. Antony and Cleopatra had about 500 ships. Octavian's admiral, Agrippa, had about 400, lighter and faster. Cleopatra commanded 60 ships of her own, the Egyptian squadron with the treasury on board. In the middle of the battle, when the line was already breaking, her ships raised sail and ran south. Antony left his flagship and followed her. Whether it was an agreed withdrawal to save the treasury or a collapse of nerve, the ancient writers cannot agree, and neither can we. What is certain is that his fleet surrendered afterwards, and his army went over within days. They had a year in Alexandria, a strange, suspended year of embassies and offers, in which Cleopatra tried to buy a throne for her children, and Antony mostly drank. She wrote to Octavian offering to abdicate if Caesarion was allowed to rule. She sent gold. She sent her crown. Octavian took the gifts and answered nothing that mattered. In the summer of 30, Octavian's army came down through Syria and across the desert. The first attack on the city came at the end of July. Antony's cavalry went over to the enemy. Then his fleet, lying in the harbour, rowed out and joined Octavian's without a fight. Antony was told, falsely or otherwise, that Cleopatra was dead. He fell on his sword. He did not die at once. He was carried, bleeding, to the mausoleum where she had shut herself in with her treasure, and hauled up through an upper window by ropes, because she would not open the doors. He died in her arms on the 1st of August. Octavian entered Alexandria the same day, without a battle. He was met at the gates by the philosopher Arius, an Alexandrian whom he knew personally. Octavian told the assembled citizens that he spared the city for 3 reasons: for the greatness of its founder, Alexander, for the beauty of the place, and for the sake of his friend Arius. And when the question of Caesarion came up, Arius is said to have answered with a line from Homer, from the 2nd book of the Iliad, where Odysseus tells the Greek army that the rule of many is no good thing. It was a pun. In Greek, the word for many rulers sounds very like too many Caesars. For the next days, Cleopatra negotiated. She was allowed to bury Antony, and she did it herself with royal honours. She was permitted to stay in the mausoleum under guard. She met Octavian in person once. He was courteous, evasive, and gave her nothing. She understood what she was being kept alive for. A triumph in Rome, walking behind a chariot in chains, as her sister Arsinoe had once walked behind Caesar's. She also knew that Caesarion, whom she had sent south towards the Red Sea with his tutor and a chest of gold, had been persuaded to turn back. His tutor had told him that Octavian was calling him home to be king. he was 17. Whether the order for his death had already been given when she made her own decision, the sources do not agree. On the 10th of August, in the year 30 before Christ, a basket of figs was carried in past the guard. When the Romans broke into the room, they found her dead on a golden couch in full ceremonial dress. Iris was dead at her feet. Charmian, dying, was straightening the diadem on her mistress's head. One of the Roman officers said to her with contempt, "Is this well done?" And Charmian answered that it was extremely well done, and fitting for the descendant of so many kings. Then she died too. Caesarion was killed within days. So was Antyllus, Antony's elder son by Fulvia. The three younger children, Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, were taken to Rome and walked in Octavian's triumph behind an effigy of their mother. Then they were handed to Octavia, Antony's Roman wife and Octavian's sister, to bring up. The two boys disappear from the record within a few years. The girl survived. Cleopatra Selene was married to Juba II, a Numidian prince raised in Rome and given the kingdom of Mauritania in North Africa. She ruled there for over 20 years. She struck coins with Egyptian symbols on them, the crocodile, the sistrum, the crescent moon of her name. She named her son Ptolemy. That son ruled Mauritania after her, until, in the year 40 of the Common Era, the Emperor Caligula summoned him to Rome and had him executed. So ended the line that had begun with Ptolemy I Soter, almost 350 years earlier. Now go back to the mausoleum on the morning of the 10th of August. 6 shadows behind her, and she is the 7th. Look at what each of them tried. The first tried the strategy of assimilation. She came as a foreigner and made herself indispensable to the country she was sent to. It worked, and she died at 28. The second tried the strategy of endurance. She survived everything, absorbed everything, forgave what could not be forgiven, and outlived them all. It worked, and it cost her every child she had. The third tried the strategy of control. She ruled her sons instead of standing beside them. It worked for 15 years, and then one of those sons poisoned her. The fourth and the fifth tried the strategy of the foreign alliance. They married outwards into Syria and turned themselves into queens abroad. One was cut down in a temple at 26. The other held a fortress for 15 years and was executed by an Armenian king at 65. The sixth tried, or was given, the strategy of invisibility. Say nothing, claim nothing, sign nothing. And she was erased so completely that we cannot say for certain whether she was one woman or two. And the seventh took all of it, assimilation, and she was the first of the family to speak Egyptian. Endurance, and she came back from exile with an army. Control, and she ruled with brothers and sons who were names on documents. The foreign alliance, twice at the largest scale available. And she is the only one of the seven whose name everybody in the world still knows. None of the 6 strategies saved the woman who used it. The 7th used all 6, and it did not save her either. But it made her the last thing the Ptolemies ever produced that the world could not throw away. And when 16 centuries later Shakespeare wrote a play about her, he wrote it about a woman who was not an exception at all. He wrote it about the end of a machine that had been running for 275 years. 275 years. 15 male Ptolemies, 7 Cleopatras, 6 of them are shadows, and 1 of them is a legend. The first was a princess from Antioch, brought to a foreign court at 11 and dead at 28. The second was handed her dismembered son at her own wedding feast and lived on to 68. The third gave up another woman's child and was poisoned by her own. The fourth was killed in the temple of Apollo with her hands still clasped around the statue. The fifth ruled a coastal fortress alone into old age and was executed on the Euphrates in the same year the seventh was born. The sixth left 1 line in a papyrus, and the seventh, at 39 years old, on a morning in August, in a mausoleum she had built herself, chose the one thing none of the others had been given. She chose the hour. Now open your eyes, or do not, and let the last thought be this one. The most famous woman of the ancient world was not a beginning. She was the last output of a machine that ran for 275 years, that consumed its own children, and that produced, at the very end, one person capable of standing in front of the Roman Empire and making it wait.